Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens, a cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore a moment that changed the global economy forever. A gathering at a mountain hotel in New Hampshire during the summer of 1944, when representatives from 44 nations came together to redesign the world's monetary system. We'll discover how this meeting, known as Bretton Woods, made America the world's banker and created an international order that shaped decades of prosperity. But don't worry. We'll move slowly and carefully through the story, taking our time with the ideas, the personalities, the quiet decisions that remade global finance. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin. The story of Bretton Woods doesn't start in 1944. It starts much earlier, in a world that believed it had found the answer to monetary stability, a world built on gold. To understand why diplomats and economists gathered in New Hampshire to create something new, we need to understand what came before, what broke, and why the world needed rebuilding. Let's go back to the 19th century, to a time when the gold standard reigned supreme. This wasn't just an economic system. It was almost a religion, a faith that gold, unchanging, precious, finite, could anchor the world's currencies and maintain order across borders. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Countries would tie their currencies to gold at fixed rates. Britain might say a pound sterling equals a certain amount of gold. The United States might say a dollar equals a different, smaller amount of gold. These fixed relationships meant that currencies had fixed relationships to each other. Trade could flow smoothly because everyone knew what money was worth. For decades before World War I, this system worked remarkably well. Gold moved between countries to balance trade. If Britain bought more from America than America bought from Britain, gold would flow from London to New York to settle the difference. This gold movement had automatic effects. When gold left Britain, the British money supply contracted, prices fell, British goods became cheaper and more competitive. Eventually, trade would rebalance. The system was self-correcting, or so people believed. No government needed to manage it much. The market, guided by gold's movement, would maintain equilibrium. The world's major economies, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, all participated in this golden network. London was the centre, the Bank of England the conductor of the global orchestra. British capital financed railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, development across the empire and beyond. The pound sterling was the world's dominant currency, backed by gold, backed by the world's most powerful navy, backed by an empire on which the sun never set. It seemed permanent, natural. The way things simply were. But permanence is always an illusion. In August 1914, the great powers of Europe went to war. What started as a diplomatic crisis, an assassination in Sarajevo, cascaded into catastrophe. Within weeks, armies were marching, and the old certainties began to crumble. Wars are expensive. They require governments to spend beyond their normal means, to mobilize entire economies, to print money and borrow on scales never before imagined. The gold standard, that elegant self-regulating system, couldn't survive the pressures of total war. Countries suspended gold convertibility. They needed to print money to pay for weapons, for soldiers, for the vast machinery of modern warfare. If citizens could exchange paper money for gold at any time, governments would run out of gold. So the link was broken, temporarily everyone said, just until the war ends. Currencies that had been as good as gold became paper backed only by government promises. And governments at war make many promises they cannot keep. The war lasted 4 years. 4 years of unimaginable destruction, of trenches and poison gas, of empires bleeding themselves white. When it finally ended in November 1918, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had gone to war. 10 million soldiers were dead. Empires had collapsed. Russia had become the Soviet Union. Germany was defeated, humiliated, saddled with enormous reparations payments. And the economic order, that gold standard system that had seemed so natural and permanent, was shattered. In the 1920s, the world tried to put things back together. Britain, France, Germany, they all attempted to restore the gold standard, to return to the old certainties. The effort was sincere but doomed. The war had shifted economic power. Britain was no longer the unchallenged financial centre. The United States, barely touched by the physical destruction, had emerged as a creditor nation, with gold flowing into its vaults. Europe was in debt, recovering from devastation, struggling with inflation and instability. Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity. This was Churchill's decision as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the economist John Maynard Keynes warned it was a mistake. By valuing the pound at its old rate, Britain made its exports expensive and its economy uncompetitive. British workers faced unemployment and wage cuts to make British prices competitive again. The policy protected the pound's prestige but hurt the people. Germany faced even worse problems. The war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles were crushing. Germany had to pay the Allies enormous sums, and it had to pay in gold or foreign currency. To do this, Germany printed money, and the result was hyperinflation so severe that by 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Savings became worthless overnight. The psychological trauma of this inflation would shape German politics for decades, creating the conditions for extremism, for the Nazi Party's rise. France and other countries formed currency blocs, groups of nations that tied their money together and tried to manage trade among themselves. The world fragmented into competing zones. The sterling bloc centred on Britain and its empire, the dollar bloc around America. The gold bloc of countries stubbornly clinging to gold standard principles. Instead of one unified system, there were rival groups pursuing their own interests. And then came the Great Depression. When the American stock market crashed in October 1929, the shockwaves spread globally. Remember, the world economy was interconnected, linked by trade and investment and debt. American banks had lent money to Germany. Germany used those loans to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used the reparations to pay war debts to America. It was a circle, a fragile web, and when American lending stopped, the whole structure collapsed. Banks failed by the thousands, in America, in Europe. Depositors lost their savings. Trade contracted as countries erected barriers to protect domestic industries. The Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States, passed in 1930, raised import duties on thousands of goods. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade spiraled downward. Unemployment rose everywhere. By 1932, a quarter of American workers were unemployed. In Germany, the rate was even higher. Britain, France, every industrial nation suffered. Countries tried to help themselves through what economists call beggarly neighbour policies. They would devalue their currencies to make their exports cheaper and more competitive. But when every country devalues, no one gains advantage. It becomes a race to the bottom, competitive devaluation that destroys confidence without helping anyone. Britain left the gold standard in 1931. Letting the pound fall, other countries followed. The gold standard, that anchor of stability, was abandoned by one nation after another. Some countries maintained capital controls, restricting how money could flow across borders. Others formed exclusive trading arrangements. Germany under the Nazis created a system of bilateral barter agreements. trading goods directly without using currency at all. The world economy didn't just contract, it fragmented into hostile blocs that didn't trust each other. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. A farmer in Iowa who grew wheat for export found his markets disappearing behind tariff walls. A factory worker in Manchester lost his job when trade dried up. A merchant in Hamburg watched his savings evaporate in inflation. These weren't abstract economic forces. They were personal catastrophes, multiplied millions of times over, creating the suffering and instability of the 1930s. The failure wasn't just economic, it was political. The chaos fed extremism. In Germany, the Nazis promised to restore prosperity and national pride. In Japan, militarists argued for empire and expansion. In America, some people wondered whether democracy and capitalism had failed, whether some other system, communism, fascism, something else, might work better. The monetary chaos contributed to political radicalization, to the breakdown of the liberal international order, to the path toward another war. By the late 1930s, as war became increasingly likely, thoughtful people understood that if the Allies won, they would need to build something better. The old gold standard was gone, proven unworkable in a world of total war and mass democracy. The chaos of competitive devaluations and trade wars had helped create conditions for fascism and conflict. Whatever came after the war would need to be different, more stable, more managed. The question was, what would it be? The answer was being developed even as the war raged, being debated in government offices in London and Washington, being refined by brilliant economists who understood that winning the peace would require planning the economic order as carefully as generals planned military campaigns. The 1930s had taught harsh lessons about what happens when monetary systems fail. The question was whether those lessons could be learned, whether nations could cooperate to create something better. So as we move forward in our story, remember that context. Remember the gold standard's promise and failure. Remember the chaos of the interwar years, the suffering of the Depression, the fragmentation and hostility that replaced cooperation. Remember that the people who would gather at Bretton Woods in 1944 were haunted by these memories, determined not to repeat these mistakes. They had seen what failure looked like. They were trying, against all the obstacles of national interest and conflicting visions, to build something that would work. Let that settle in your mind for now. The world before Bretton Woods was a world of broken promises and failed systems, a world learning through terrible experience that international money requires international cooperation. We'll continue this journey, but there's no rush. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of these years rest lightly on you. The story continues, but for now, let yourself drift if you need to. We'll be here when you return. The world was broken, and everyone knew it needed fixing. But knowing something needs fixing and agreeing on how to fix it are very different things. As the Second World War raged across Europe and the Pacific, as millions fought and died, a quieter battle was being waged in government offices and academic studies. A battle of ideas about what the post-war world should look like. At the centre of this intellectual struggle were two men. Two brilliant economists with competing visions for the future of international finance. Their names were John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White. Let's start with Keynes, because he was already famous, already a legend in his own lifetime. Born in 1883 in Cambridge, England, Keynes was the son of academics, raised in an atmosphere of intellectual rigour and high culture. He was educated at Eton and Cambridge, moving in circles where ideas mattered, where conversation ranged across economics and philosophy and art. He was tall, striking, with a commanding presence and devastating wit. He could charm or demolish with equal ease. Keynes had made his reputation after World War I by predicting correctly that the Treaty of Versailles would fail. The harsh reparations imposed on Germany, he argued in his book The Economic Consequences of the Peace, would create instability and resentment. He was right. But being right didn't make him popular with politicians who had negotiated the treaty. Still, his brilliance was undeniable. Through the 1920s and 30s, he revolutionized economic thinking, arguing that governments could and should intervene in economies to prevent depressions, that leaving everything to the market was dangerous and unnecessary. By the time World War II began, Keynes was not just an economist, but a public intellectual, a figure of enormous influence in Britain. He advised the Treasury, wrote for newspapers, moved in the higher circles of British society. He was also a man of the Bloomsbury Group, that circle of artists and writers and intellectuals who defied Victorian conventions. He was married to a Russian ballerina, Lydia Lopokova. He collected art, loved theatre, lived richly despite chronic health problems that would eventually kill him. When Britain went to war in September 1939, Keynes immediately began thinking about the post-war world. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that winning the war was only half the battle. If the peace was mishandled economically, as it had been after World War I, all the sacrifice would be wasted. He began drafting proposals for a new international monetary system, one that would avoid the mistakes of the gold standard and the chaos of the 1930s. Keynes's vision was ambitious and elegant. He proposed creating an international currency, which he called Bancor. This wouldn't be real money that people carried in their pockets. It would be an accounting unit, a way of keeping track of trade between nations. Countries would settle their international debts in Bancor, managed by a new international institution that Keynes wanted to call the International Clearing Union. The beauty of this system was its symmetry. Countries that ran persistent trade surpluses would be pressured to adjust, just as countries running deficits would be. The burden of adjustment would be shared. Under the gold standard, and under the system that would eventually emerge, deficit countries bore all the pressure. If you were importing more than you were exporting, you had to fix it by cutting spending, by deflating your economy, by accepting unemployment and pain. Surplus countries faced no similar pressure. They could just accumulate gold or foreign currency indefinitely. Keynes thought this was fundamentally unfair and economically damaging. His Bancor system would penalise both excessive surpluses and excessive deficits, encouraging countries to maintain rough balance. Keynes also wanted the new system to have plenty of liquidity, enough international currency that countries wouldn't have to deflate their economies to settle trade imbalances. He had lived through the Depression, had seen how the shortage of gold and the rigid rules of the gold standard had forced countries to choose between maintaining currency values and maintaining employment. He wanted a system with flexibility, with room for countries to pursue full employment without being constantly constrained by balance of payments crises. This was a radical vision, and it reflected Keynes's fundamental belief that economic systems should serve human needs, not the other way around. Money, in his view, was a tool, not a master. The international monetary system should facilitate trade and employment and prosperity, not impose rigid rules that forced unnecessary suffering. These ideas came from deep conviction, from watching Britain suffer in the 20s and 30s because of misguided attachment to the gold standard's supposed discipline. But Keynes was negotiating from a position of weakness, and he knew it. Britain was fighting for survival. The nation was brave and determined, but it was also exhausted and broke. The war was costing everything Britain had. Factories were producing weapons instead of goods for export. Ships carrying imports were being sunk by German submarines. Britain was surviving on American aid, on Lend-Lease, on borrowed money and borrowed time. Whatever system emerged after the war, Britain would not dictate its terms. That privilege would belong to the country with the money, with the power, with the gold in its vaults. That country was the United States. Now let's turn to Harry Dexter White, a man less famous than Keynes but equally important to our story. White was born in 1892 in Boston, the son of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania. His family was not wealthy or well-connected. White worked his way up through intelligence and determination and relentless hard work. He studied economics, earned a doctorate, taught at Lawrence College in Wisconsin. He was academic, serious, not given to the brilliant conversation and social grace that came so naturally to Keynes. In 1934, White joined the US Treasury Department, working in the research division. He was competent and dedicated, and he rose through the bureaucracy until he became the chief international economist and right-hand man to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. White was intensely patriotic, convinced that American power could be a force for good in the world, that the United States could lead the creation of a stable, prosperous international order. White's vision for the post-war monetary system was different from Keynes's, reflecting different interests and different power realities. He agreed with Keynes that the world needed a new system, that the gold standard was dead, and that something managed and cooperative should replace it. But White wanted the American dollar, not some invented currency like Bancor, to be at the system's centre. He proposed that countries would fix their exchange rates to the dollar, and the dollar would be convertible to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. The dollar, backed by America's enormous gold reserves, would become the world's key currency. White also proposed creating two new international institutions. The International Monetary Fund would help countries manage their exchange rates and provide short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments problems. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later called the World Bank, would provide long-term loans for rebuilding after the war and for development projects. These institutions would be based on subscriptions from member countries, with voting power roughly proportional to economic size. This meant, of course, that the United States would have the largest vote, effective veto power over major decisions. White's plan was less symmetrical than Keynes's. It placed more burden on deficit countries to adjust. It gave less flexibility to countries in trouble. But it was also more realistic in the sense that it reflected the power relationships that actually existed. America had the gold, had the productive capacity, had emerged from the Depression, and would emerge from the war as the world's dominant economy. White's plan acknowledged these realities and built a system around them. The two men, Keynes and White, began meeting in 1941, even before America formally entered the war. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought America into the conflict, the discussions intensified. They met in Washington, in London, in lengthy negotiations that were sometimes cooperative and sometimes tense. Each man understood what was at stake. They were designing the architecture of the post-war world, creating the framework within which international trade and finance would operate for decades. The dynamic between them was fascinating. Keynes was the senior figure, the famous economist, the man whose theories had already changed the world. White was younger, less known, but he held the stronger hand because he represented the stronger country. Keynes could dazzle with rhetoric and logic. White could say, politely but firmly, that American power and American gold meant American preferences would largely prevail. There was also a personal dimension. Keynes could be condescending, particularly to people he considered intellectual inferiors. White was prickly, defensive about his position, unwilling to be charmed or overawed by Keynes's brilliance and reputation. They respected each other's intelligence, but there was friction. Keynes wrote of White with grudging admiration mixed with frustration. White viewed Keynes as representing a declining empire trying to maintain privileges it could no longer afford. The negotiations proceeded through 1942 and 1943. Drafts were exchanged, revised, and negotiated. Keynes tried to preserve as much of his Bancor vision as possible. White insisted on the centrality of the dollar. Slowly, through countless meetings and memoranda, a compromise emerged. It would be more White's plan than Keynes's, but it would incorporate some Keynesian ideas about flexibility and cooperation. The dollar would be the key currency, but there would be institutions, the IMF and World Bank, that gave other countries some voice, some protection, some access to liquidity. By early 1944, the outline was clear enough to invite other nations to join the discussion. Britain and America couldn't simply impose a system on the world, or at least they had to maintain the fiction of broader consultation. The Allied powers were fighting for democracy and freedom against fascism and tyranny. The post-war order had to reflect those values, or at least appear to. So plans were made for a grand international conference where all the Allied nations could participate in designing the new monetary system. The location chosen was the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It was remote, peaceful, removed from the war. The hotel was grand and somewhat faded, a resort from an earlier era. It could accommodate hundreds of delegates. It had meeting rooms and dining facilities. And perhaps most importantly, it was in the United States which sent a message about who would be leading this new order. Keynes, despite his health problems, he had suffered a heart attack in 1937 and was often in pain and exhausted, prepared to attend. This would be his last great performance, his final attempt to shape the world according to his vision of what was economically wise and morally right. He knew he was fighting a losing battle in many respects. Britain's power was fading. The empire that had dominated the 19th century was being eclipsed by American might. The best Keynes could hope for was to temper American dominance with international institutions that gave smaller countries some voice and some protection. White, meanwhile, prepared methodically. This was his moment, his chance to implement ideas he'd been developing for years. He would chair crucial committees at the conference. He would manage details and shepherd agreements through complex negotiations with dozens of countries. Where Keynes was the brilliant improviser, White was the careful planner, the man who understood that international agreements require patience and attention to detail. There was also something else about Harry Dexter White, something that wouldn't become known for years. He was passing information to Soviet intelligence. The extent of his cooperation with the Soviets is still debated by historians, but documents released after the Cold War ended make clear he had contact with Soviet agents and provided them with information. Whether he was an ideological communist who believed he was serving a higher cause, or whether he thought he was just facilitating an ally during wartime, we may never fully know. He died in 1948, before he could be formally charged with anything. His reputation destroyed by accusations he never had a chance to fully answer. But in 1944, none of this was known. White was a senior American official trusted by Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, working to build an international monetary system that would prevent another depression and another war. His personal complications and conflicted loyalties were hidden, would remain hidden until long after both he and Keynes were dead. As the date for the Bretton Woods Conference approached, both men felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were trying to learn from the catastrophic failures of the interwar period, to create mechanisms that would make another Great Depression impossible, to build cooperation in place of the competitive chaos that had poisoned the 30s. They were trying to do this while war still raged, while the outcome was still uncertain, while planning for peace seemed almost presumptuous given how much fighting remained. Keynes travelled to America in June 1944, crossing the Atlantic by ship, conserving his failing strength for the ordeal ahead. White remained in Washington, coordinating American preparations, ensuring that the conference would achieve what American interest required. And 44 nations prepared to send delegates to a hotel in the New Hampshire mountains to participate in an experiment in international cooperation, to try to build something better from the ruins of what had failed. The stage was set. The intellectual groundwork had been laid. Two brilliant men, representing two very different visions and two nations at different points in their trajectories of power, had created the framework. Now it would need to be negotiated, refined, made real. The gathering at Bretton Woods would be where theory met politics, where grand visions confronted the messy reality of getting dozens of countries to agree. Let those two figures rest in your mind for a moment. Keynes, elegant and exhausted, fighting for a vision of international cooperation that might save Britain's position in a changing world. White, methodical and determined, building an American-centered system that would reflect and reinforce American power. Both of them trying, in their different ways, to prevent the horrors of the 30s from ever happening again. Both of them flawed, complicated men, neither purely noble nor purely self-interested, just humans trying to solve enormously complex problems with the tools of intellect and negotiation. The story continues, but let yourself rest with these two men for now. Picture them in 1944, meeting in government offices, arguing over drafts, trying to find common ground. The world's future monetary system being debated over cups of coffee, being scribbled on notepads, being revised and refined. History isn't just great forces and impersonal trends. It's also individuals making choices, arguing about details, compromising on principles. It's Keynes and White preparing for Bretton Woods. Breathe slowly. Let the image settle. We'll continue when you're ready. In the first week of July 1944, delegates from 44 nations began arriving at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The timing was significant. Just a month earlier, Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy, beginning the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation. The war was far from over. Brutal fighting continued in France and Italy across the Pacific, but the eventual Allied victory seemed more certain than it had in years. It was time to plan seriously for peace, to build the institutions that would govern the post-war world. The Mount Washington Hotel stood at the base of Mount Washington, the highest peak in the northeastern United States, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Built in 1902, the hotel was a grand reminder of an earlier era, of Gilded Age luxury and leisure. It had 235 rooms, wide verandas, a dining room that could seat hundreds. The architecture was imposing, red-roofed, sprawling, designed for wealthy tourists seeking mountain air and elegant relaxation. By 1944, the hotel had seen better days, was a bit worn and faded, but it was still magnificent in its way. The choice of location was deliberate. The organisers wanted somewhere that could accommodate hundreds of people for weeks, somewhere with meeting rooms and facilities for a major international conference. But they also wanted isolation, somewhere removed from distractions and from the war. Bretton Woods offered both. Delegates would be able to focus entirely on the work at hand, negotiating and debating without the interruptions of Washington or London or other major cities. The mountain setting was beautiful, peaceful, almost otherworldly, given that much of the world was still engulfed in violence. 730 delegates, advisors, and staff descended on the small New Hampshire town that summer. They came from China and the Soviet Union, from India and Mexico, from nearly every country aligned with the Allied cause. The largest delegations were British and American, of course, but dozens of other nations sent representatives, each hoping to have some voice in shaping the post-war monetary order. Many had travelled enormous distances under difficult wartime conditions. Ships were still being sunk, air travel was limited and dangerous. Getting to New Hampshire from, say, Ethiopia or the Philippines in July 1944 required determination and considerable hardship. The conference opened on July 1st, 1944. That first day was largely ceremonial. Welcoming remarks, organisational matters, the formal opening of an event that had been years in planning. Henry Morgenthau, the US Treasury Secretary, served as president of the conference. He was a loyal supporter of President Roosevelt, a decent man if not a particularly brilliant economist. His opening speech emphasised cooperation and shared purpose, the importance of preventing another economic catastrophe like the Great Depression. But the real work happened in committees, in long sessions that stretched from morning until late at night, in tedious negotiations over technical details that might seem minor, but that would shape how the system actually functioned. There were three main commissions. Commission 1 dealt with the International Monetary Fund. Commission 2 addressed the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Commission 3 tackled other forms of international financial cooperation. Each commission had subcommittees, and each subcommittee had working groups. The organisational complexity was daunting. Keynes chaired Commission 2 on the World Bank. White chaired Commission 1 on the International Monetary Fund. This division reflected both men's strengths and their nation's priorities. The IMF was more important to American interests. It would manage exchange rates and the dollar's role. The World Bank mattered more to Britain, which would need reconstruction loans after the war. Each man could champion his nation's interests while also negotiating the overall system. The physical conditions at the hotel were challenging. July in New Hampshire can be hot and humid, and 1944 was particularly brutal. The hotel had no air conditioning. Windows were opened wide, but the air barely moved. Delegates sweltered in suits and ties. In those days, formal dress was mandatory for such occasions. Men mopped their brows with handkerchiefs, loosened their ties when they thought no one important was watching, suffered through the heat because the work was too important to abandon over mere discomfort. The meeting rooms were crowded and stuffy. Dozens of people crammed into spaces meant for smaller gatherings, smoking cigarettes and pipes, filling the air with tobacco smoke that mixed with the heat and humidity to create an almost unbearable atmosphere. Translation was necessary for many delegates, adding another layer of complexity. Interpreters worked to render technical economic discussions from English to French to Russian to Chinese, trying to ensure that everyone understood the proposals being debated. The days were long. Sessions often ran from 9 in the morning until midnight or later. Delegates survived on coffee and cigarettes, on hurried meals grabbed between meetings, on whatever reserves of energy they could muster. For Keynes, whose health was fragile, the schedule was punishing. He pushed himself beyond what his body could reasonably handle, driven by the importance of the work and by his determination to shape the outcome as much as British interests allowed. The Soviet delegation was significant. The Soviet Union had been invited and had sent a substantial group of representatives led by Mikhail Stepanov, though the real power was held by officials in Moscow who would need to approve any agreements. Stalin was interested in post-war reconstruction loans and in ensuring that the new international institutions wouldn't be used against Soviet interests. The presence of the Soviets added another dimension to the negotiations. The beginning of tensions that would become the Cold War were already visible, though still subordinate to the common effort to defeat the Axis powers. China sent a large delegation led by H.O. Sang-kung, the finance minister and brother-in-law of Chiang Kai-shek. China had been fighting Japan since 1937, had suffered enormously, and wanted recognition as a great power in the post-war world. India, still under British colonial rule but pushing for independence, sent representatives who sometimes clashed with the British delegation over India's interest versus imperial policy. These tensions between colonizers and colonized, between established powers and rising nations, between capitalism and communism, all simmered beneath the technical discussions of exchange rates and voting quotas. The smaller countries faced a challenge. The American and British delegations had been preparing for years, had teams of experts, had clear positions worked out in detail. Smaller nations had less preparation time, fewer experts, less leverage. They had to try to understand complex technical proposals, assess how those proposals would affect their interests, and negotiate for modifications, all while the great powers were essentially dictating the overall framework. It was not exactly democratic, but it was more consultative than simply having America and Britain impose a system without any input. The negotiations over the International Monetary Fund were particularly intense. The key questions were how much flexibility countries would have to change their exchange rates, how much money the fund would have to lend to countries in trouble, and how voting power would be distributed. White's American plan called for fixed exchange rates. Each country would declare a par value for its currency in relation to the dollar, and the dollar would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. This was the core of the system, the mechanism that would provide stability. But Keynes and others argued for flexibility. What if a country's exchange rate became clearly wrong, unsustainable? Should it be forced to deflate its entire economy just to maintain an arbitrary fixed rate? That had been the gold standard's great failing, the rigidity that had turned recessions into depressions. The compromise reached allowed countries to change their exchange rates if they faced quote two, a deliberately vague phrase that gave some flexibility while maintaining the principle of stable rates. Small changes of up to 10% could be made without IMF approval. Larger changes required approval, which would presumably be granted if clearly necessary. The question of how much money the IMF would have to lend was equally contentious. Keynes wanted a large fund, enough liquidity to help countries through temporary balance of payments problems without forcing them into deflation and unemployment. White and the Americans wanted a more modest fund, worried about unlimited commitments and about countries becoming dependent on IMF lending rather than fixing their own economic problems. The final figure settled on was $8.8 billion in quotas from member countries. This sounds large, but it was actually quite modest relative to the likely scale of post-war economic problems. Keynes had wanted more, but accepted what he could get. Voting power in the IMF was allocated based on quotas, which were supposed to reflect each country's economic size and importance in world trade. The United States, as the largest economy and contributor, would have the biggest vote, about 30% of the total. Britain would have the second largest vote at about 14%. The Soviet Union, China, and France would have smaller but still significant votes. This meant the United States had effective veto power over major decisions, which required 80% approval. America could block anything it didn't like, but couldn't act without support from other countries. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, was designed to provide long-term loans for rebuilding war-damaged economies and for development projects in poorer countries. Its initial capital was set at $10 billion, though not all of this would be paid in immediately. The bank would be able to borrow money in capital markets, using its strong credit rating backed by member governments, and then lend that money at favourable rates for productive projects. Keynes was particularly interested in the bank, because Britain would need substantial loans to rebuild after the war. There were arguments over governance, over how the bank would decide which projects to fund, over whether it should focus mainly on reconstruction or also on development. The Americans wanted the bank headquartered in the United States, which would give them more control. Others wanted it in a more neutral location. Eventually Washington was chosen, another indication of where real power lay. The president of the World Bank would traditionally be an American, while the managing director of the IMF would traditionally be European, an informal bargain that has held to this day. Keynes fought battles over language and principles. He wanted the agreements to emphasize full employment as a goal, to recognize that the purpose of the international monetary system was to serve human welfare, not just to maintain exchange rate stability. He wanted protections for countries pursuing expansionary economic policies, assurance they wouldn't be forced into deflation just to defend currency values. He won some of these arguments in the language of the final agreements, though how much practical difference it would make remained to be seen. The smaller countries tried to extract concessions and protections. They wanted assurance that they wouldn't be bullied by the great powers, that the IMF and World Bank would serve all members fairly. They wanted their voices heard, their interests considered. They achieved some modest victories, provisions that gave them more votes collectively than their individual economic weight might suggest, procedures that provided some due process in decision-making. But the fundamental reality was clear. This would be an American-led system, with Britain as junior partner and everyone else accepting terms largely set by the Anglo-American negotiations. There were social events in the evenings, dinners and receptions where delegates could relax or at least pretend to relax. Keynes was often the centre of attention at these gatherings, charming people with his wit and erudition, telling stories, holding court. White was less comfortable in social settings but still present, working the room in his more methodical way, talking to delegates about their concerns, trying to build consensus. The social dimension mattered almost as much as the formal negotiations. Personal relationships built over dinner could smooth out conflicts that seemed intractable in committee meetings. The food at the hotel was adequate but not luxurious, rationing being in effect even in America. But there was enough, and the sheer abundance compared to what British delegates had been living with. Britain had severe food rationing throughout the war was notable. Some British delegates ate with an enthusiasm that bordered on desperation, savouring butter and sugar and meat that had become rare luxuries at home. These small human details remind us that these were real people, not just historical figures, people who experienced hunger and exhaustion and relief at a good meal. As July progressed, as the negotiations continued day after long day, a final agreement began to take shape. It wouldn't satisfy everyone completely. Keynes had been forced to accept a much more American-centred system than he'd originally envisioned. His Bancor idea was dead. The dollar would reign. But there would be institutions, rules, mechanisms for cooperation. That was something. That was better than the chaos of the 1930s, better than a return to competitive devaluations and trade wars. The smaller countries had gotten less than they'd hoped, but more than they might have feared. They would have voices in the new institutions, even if those voices would often be overruled by American and British power. They would have access to IMF loans in times of crisis, access to World Bank funding for development. They would participate in a system that, while dominated by the powerful, at least pretended to be a community of nations working together. On July 22nd, 1944, the final agreement was ready for signing. In the hotel's grand ballroom, delegates gathered for the closing ceremony. Morgenthau presided, giving a speech about the historic nature of what had been accomplished. Keynes spoke, elegant and moving even in exhaustion, praising the cooperation that had made the agreement possible, while gently noting that implementation would be the real test. One by one, the delegates signed the Articles of Agreement for the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The Bretton Woods Agreement, as it came to be called, was now official. It would still need to be ratified by member governments, still need to be implemented, still need to prove it could actually work. But the framework was in place. The architecture of the post-war monetary order had been designed. The dollar was at the centre, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, with other currencies pegged to the dollar. The IMF would manage the system, help countries maintain their pegs, provide loans to countries in temporary difficulty. The World Bank would fund reconstruction and development. That evening, after the signing, there was a celebratory dinner. The relief was palpable. 3 weeks of intense work in brutal heat, of complex negotiations and difficult compromises had produced an agreement. Whether it was the right agreement, whether it would work, whether it would achieve the goal of preventing another depression and another war, these questions remained open. But something had been accomplished. 44 nations had cooperated to create new international institutions, had agreed on rules and mechanisms for managing international money and finance. In a world still at war, still tearing itself apart, this achievement of cooperation seemed almost miraculous. Keynes was exhausted beyond words. The conference had taken everything he had to give. He would stay in America for a few more weeks, dealing with other aspects of Anglo-American economic relations before returning to Britain. He had another year and a half of life remaining, dying in April 1946 of a heart attack, his body finally giving out after years of overwork and strain. He would not live to see whether Bretton Woods succeeded or failed, whether his efforts and compromises had been worthwhile. White would continue working at Treasury, helping to implement the Bretton Woods system, managing the difficult transition from wartime to peacetime economy. The accusations about his Soviet connections would emerge later, destroying his reputation, leading to his death under the shadow of suspicion. But in July 1944, he could feel satisfied. He had been the architect, the man who had turned ideas into institutional reality. The system bore his stamp more than Keynes's, reflected American power and interests as he had intended. The delegates dispersed, returning to their countries, carrying the agreement back for ratification and implementation. The Mount Washington Hotel would return to being a resort, its brief moment as the birthplace of a new economic order complete. The little town of Bretton Woods would lend its name to an era, the Bretton Woods system. The monetary order that would govern international finance for nearly 3 decades. But that was all still to come. For now, in late July 1944, there was just relief and exhaustion, and cautious hope that something important had been achieved. Let that image rest with you for a moment. The delegates signing, Morgenthau and Keynes and White watching, hundreds of people crammed into a ballroom in a New Hampshire hotel, creating the framework for how international money would work in the post-war world. The heat, the exhaustion, the compromise and cooperation. The sense that however imperfect the agreement might be, it was better than nothing, better than returning to the chaos of the past. The war still raged, the future remained uncertain, but at least there was a plan, a system, a set of institutions that might help prevent the economic catastrophes that had helped cause the war in the first place. Breathe slowly. Picture that mountain hotel, the delegates gathering their papers, preparing to leave, carrying with them the agreements that would reshape global finance. The work of Bretton Woods was done. The work of making it function was just beginning. We'll continue this journey, but rest here for now. Let the scene settle. The summer of 1944, a moment of hope and planning in the midst of war. Let it drift through your mind as you drift towards sleep. The delegates left Bretton Woods, but the agreements they had signed were just papers, just promises. Turning those promises into functioning institutions, into a real system that would govern international finance, would take years of difficult work. And it would require something that couldn't be taken for granted in the aftermath of war, that governments would actually ratify the agreements, that countries would put aside immediate self-interest for the sake of international cooperation. The first challenge was ratification. The Bretton Woods agreements needed to be approved by parliaments and legislatures around the world. This wasn't automatic, wasn't guaranteed. In every country there were skeptics and opponents. People who worried that joining these new international institutions meant surrendering national sovereignty, accepting rules made by others, subordinating domestic interest to international obligations. These weren't unreasonable concerns. They were the eternal tension in any international system between independence and cooperation. The United States, despite having largely designed the system, faced significant opposition. The debate in Congress revealed deep divisions about America's role in the world. Isolationists argued that America should focus on its own affairs, not entangle itself in permanent international commitments. Bankers worried that the IMF and World Bank would compete with private lending, or would subsidize bad policies in other countries. Some conservatives opposed anything that smacked of international government, anything that limited American freedom of action. The Roosevelt administration lobbied hard for ratification. Treasury officials gave speeches, testified before committees, explained how Bretton Woods would serve American interests. They emphasized that a stable international monetary system would help American exports, that preventing another depression abroad would prevent one at home, that American leadership of these institutions would enhance American power and influence. They also invoked the lessons of the 1930s, the costs of isolationism and economic nationalism, the way financial chaos had contributed to the rise of fascism and war. In July 1945, Congress approved American participation in the IMF and World Bank. This was crucial. Without American membership, The institutions would have been stillborn. America was providing most of the capital, would have the largest vote, would host the institutions in Washington. American participation made Bretton Woods real rather than theoretical. But the debate had been close enough to worry the system's architects. The margin of support wasn't overwhelming, and there would always be American politicians skeptical of international commitments. Britain faced even more difficult choices. The Bretton Woods Agreements required Britain to make the pound sterling convertible, meaning holders of pounds could exchange them for other currencies or for gold within a year of the IMF beginning operations. This was a frightening prospect. Britain's economy was shattered by 6 years of total war. A quarter of Britain's national wealth had been destroyed or consumed. The merchant fleet that had carried British trade around the world had been decimated by submarine warfare. Factories that had produced exports were retooled for weapons production and would take years to convert back. Britain was surviving on American aid, on Lend-Lease, on postponed debts. When the war ended in August 1945, the Americans abruptly cut off Lend-Lease. This was economically catastrophic for Britain. The economy couldn't function without imports, food, raw materials, fuel. But Britain couldn't pay for imports without exports, and exports couldn't recover overnight. Britain faced the prospect of either starving or begging for more American help. John Maynard Keynes, though exhausted and ill, made one final trip to Washington in the fall of 1945 to negotiate what came to be called the Anglo-American Loan. Britain needed billions of dollars to bridge the gap between the end of Lend-Lease and the recovery of British exports. Keynes hoped to negotiate a grant, or at least a very generous interest-free loan. He argued that Britain had fought for years while America remained neutral, that Britain had bankrupted itself in the common cause, that America owed Britain for holding the line against Nazi Germany when America was still at peace. The Americans were sympathetic but firm. They would provide a loan, $3,750 million, which was substantial, but it would carry interest 2%, and Britain would have to repay it. And crucially, as a condition of the loan, Britain would have to make sterling convertible within 1 year of the loan's approval, and would have to dismantle the system of imperial trade preferences that protected British and Commonwealth trade from American competition. These were harsh terms. They reflected American power and American determination to open the world to American trade. The loan agreement was debated bitterly in the British Parliament. Many members felt humiliated by the terms, are angry that Britain's wartime ally was driving such a hard bargain when Britain was on its knees. Some called it economic imperialism, America using financial power to dismantle the British Empire and British influence. Others argued that Britain had no choice, that the alternative was economic collapse. The loan was approved, but the resentment lingered. Britain would spend decades paying off wartime debts, a constant reminder of how the war had ended British financial independence. While these political battles were being fought, the technical work of creating the IMF and World Bank proceeded. The institutions needed headquarters, staff, procedures, all the infrastructure of bureaucracy. Washington was chosen as the location, which meant finding office space, hiring employees, creating organizational structures from scratch. The first managing director of the IMF was a Belgian, Camille Gut. The first president of the World Bank was an American, Eugene Meyer, a former chairman of the Federal Reserve. These early leaders faced the challenge of making abstract agreements into functioning organizations. What exactly would it mean for the IMF to manage the international monetary system? How would the World Bank decide which projects to fund? What procedures would govern decision-making? How would the institutions relate to member governments, to markets, to each other? None of this had been fully worked out at Bretton Woods. The conference had created frameworks, but implementation required filling in countless details. The IMF began operations in March 1947, nearly 3 years after the Bretton Woods Conference. The delay reflected how long it took to get enough countries to ratify the agreements, to set up the institutions, to work through the enormous complexity of creating new international organizations. The world had been limping along without a functioning monetary system for that entire period, relying on bilateral arrangements and American aid rather than multilateral institutions. The IMF's first major task was to establish the par values, the fixed exchange rates, for member currencies. Each country declared what its currency would be worth in relation to the dollar, and therefore in relation to gold, since the dollar was fixed at $35 per ounce. This required extensive negotiation and analysis. If a country set its par value too high, its exports would be uncompetitive. If it set the rate too low, imports would be expensive and inflation would result. Finding the right rate was as much art as science, involving judgment about a country's economy, its trade patterns, its likely growth. The World Bank began lending in May 1947 with a loan to France for post-war reconstruction. The loan was for $250 million, used to purchase equipment and materials that France needed to rebuild. Other loans followed, to the Netherlands, to Denmark, to Luxembourg. These early World Bank loans focused on infrastructure and industrial reconstruction, helping Europe rebuild what war had destroyed. The amounts were significant, but nowhere near sufficient to fund all of Europe's reconstruction needs. The real rebuilding would require something larger. That something larger was the Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947. The Marshall Plan was an American commitment to provide massive aid to rebuild Western Europe, ultimately about $13 billion over 4 years. This wasn't channeled through the World Bank. It was direct government-to-government aid, motivated partly by generosity and partly by cold calculation that a prosperous Europe would be both a market for American goods and a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan solved what economists called the dollar shortage problem. Europe desperately needed to import goods from America, machinery, raw materials, food, to rebuild and to recover. But Europe didn't have dollars to pay for these imports because European exports weren't recovering fast enough. The Marshall Plan provided the dollars, allowing European countries to purchase American goods and begin the process of reconstruction and growth. It was extraordinarily successful, perhaps the most successful foreign aid program in history, helping to launch what became known as the European economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s. The Marshall Plan also revealed something important about the Bretton Woods system. It couldn't function without enormous American financial support. The IMF's resources, though substantial, weren't nearly enough to bridge the gap between Europe's needs and Europe's capacity to pay. America had to provide dollars through aid, through military spending in Europe, through private investment, through loans. The Bretton Woods system depended on American willingness to run balance of payments deficits, to let dollars flow out to the rest of the world. This would later create problems, but in the late 40s and early 50s, it was essential to making the system work. Britain's experience with convertibility was a disaster. In July 1947, as required by the loan agreement, Britain made the pound convertible. Immediately there was a run on British reserves. Anyone holding pounds could now exchange them for dollars, and many people did, because they trusted dollars more than pounds, or because they wanted to buy American goods, or because they were speculating that the pound would have to be devalued. Within weeks, Britain was hemorrhaging foreign exchange reserves. By August, Britain had lost nearly $1 billion in reserves. The government was forced to suspend convertibility after just 5 weeks. This humiliating failure showed that the Bretton Woods vision of widespread convertibility was premature. European economies were too weak, too damaged, too uncompetitive to allow free exchange of currencies. They needed protection, needed controls on capital movements, needed time to rebuild before they could participate in an open system. The IMF, designed to manage convertible currencies and temporary balance of payments problems, found itself largely irrelevant to the actual problems countries faced. Its resources were too small, and countries were reluctant to borrow from it anyway, because IMF lending came with conditions and scrutiny that countries preferred to avoid. Through the late 40s and into the early 50s, Europe maintained elaborate systems of exchange controls and trade restrictions. Currencies weren't freely convertible. Trade was managed through bilateral agreements and quotas. The elegant vision from Bretton Woods of fixed but convertible currencies facilitating free trade remained more aspiration than reality. The actual international monetary system was messier, more controlled, more dependent on American aid than the Bretton Woods architects had envisioned. The World Bank, meanwhile, struggled to find its role. By the early 1950s, European reconstruction was largely complete, or at least no longer needed World Bank lending. American aid through the Marshall Plan had been far more important. The bank began shifting its focus to development lending in poorer countries, Latin America, Asia, Africa. This was important work. Funding dams and roads and power plants that might help countries develop, but it also meant the bank was moving away from its original purpose of reconstruction toward a new role that hadn't been fully contemplated at Bretton Woods. The institutions were adapting, learning, finding their way through problems that theoretical planning couldn't have anticipated. This is the nature of institutions. They're created with purposes and designs, but they evolve as they confront reality, as they respond to problems and opportunities that emerge. The IMF and World Bank of the early 1950s weren't exactly what Keynes and White had designed at Bretton Woods. They were something different, shaped by the actual conditions they faced and the actual demands placed on them. By the early 1950s, a pattern was becoming clear. The Bretton Woods system would work, but not quite as designed. Fixed exchange rates would provide stability, but they wouldn't be truly fixed. Countries would adjust them when necessary. Convertibility would eventually come, but gradually, as countries became strong enough to handle it. The IMF would provide some liquidity and some pressure for good policies, but the real liquidity would come from American deficits and American aid. The World Bank would fund some important projects, but it would be a relatively small player in the vast task of global development. And at the centre of it all was the dollar, backed by American gold, accepted everywhere, providing the foundation for international trade and finance. The system was working not because of elegant design, but because of American power and American willingness to support it. America provided the gold backing, the aid, the military spending abroad that supplied dollars to the world, the large market that absorbed other countries' exports. As long as America was willing and able to play this role, the system could function. The question that would emerge later, the question that would eventually bring the system down, was whether America could sustain this role indefinitely. Could America keep running deficits, keep providing dollars to the world, keep backing all those dollars with gold forever? Or would there come a point where the mathematics caught up, where the commitments exceeded the capacity, where something would have to give? In the early 1950s, these questions still seemed distant, theoretical. The system was working, Europe was recovering, trade was growing. The Bretton Woods vision, however imperfectly realised, was creating the stability and cooperation that its architects had sought. Let that early period rest in your thoughts for a moment. The years between Bretton Woods and the functioning system, between the conference in New Hampshire and the reality of international institutions managing global finance, the difficulties of ratification, the compromises and failures, the gap between theory and practice. Keynes had died in 1946, his life's final effort incomplete. White would die in 1948, his reputation soon to be destroyed by accusations he couldn't answer. The system they had built would have to function without them, would have to adapt and evolve as new people and new circumstances shaped it. But it was taking shape. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and adjustments, but taking shape nonetheless. The post-war international monetary order was being born, not exactly as planned, not as smoothly as hoped, but being born. The dollar was at the centre, the institutions existed, the framework was in place. What would happen next, whether the system could deliver on its promise of stability and prosperity, remained to be seen. But the foundation had been laid, and the world was starting to build on it. Rest with that image. The late 1940s, the world slowly recovering. Slowly building something new from the ruins. Let it settle gently in your mind. The 1950s dawned with cautious optimism. The worst fears of the immediate post-war period, that Europe would collapse into chaos, that depression would return, that the international economy would fragment again into hostile blocs, had not materialized. Instead, something remarkable was happening. The world economy was growing, faster and more consistently than anyone had dared to hope. The Bretton Woods system, for all its imperfections and compromises, was providing a framework within which this growth could flourish. In France, they called these decades, quote, 5, the 30 glorious years. From the late 1940s through the early 1970s, the French economy grew at rates that seemed almost miraculous compared to the stagnation of the interwar period. Industrial production soared. Living standards rose dramatically. The devastation of war gave way to prosperity that touched not just the wealthy, but ordinary workers and their families. And France was not unique. Across Western Europe, the story was similar. Rapid growth, rising incomes, the construction of welfare states that provided security and opportunity. Germany's recovery was perhaps the most dramatic. The country had been literally in ruins in 1945, its cities bombed to rubble, its industry destroyed, its population traumatized and displaced. By the mid-1950s, West Germany was growing so fast that economists spoke of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Factories hummed, exports flowed. The Deutsche Mark became one of the world's strongest currencies. Germans who had known only hardship and defeat found themselves living in comfort, driving Volkswagens, taking vacations. The transformation was stunning. Japan's rise was equally remarkable. The country had been devastated by war. 2 cities destroyed by atomic bombs, its empire lost, its military dissolved. American occupation initially focused on punishment and reform, but as the Cold War intensified, American policy shifted toward rebuilding Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. Japanese industry, with American encouragement and technology, began producing goods that competed globally. By the 1960s, Japan was emerging as an industrial powerhouse, challenging Western dominance in automobiles, electronics, steel. Even Britain, despite the trauma of imperial decline and the failed convertibility experiment, experienced growth that its citizens found remarkable. The National Health Service was created, providing healthcare free at point of use. The welfare state expanded, providing security from cradle to grave. Working-class families moved from cramped urban tenements to suburban housing estates with gardens. Young people accessed higher education in numbers never before seen. Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, declared in 1957 that Britons had never had it so good. And while there was political calculation in the statement, there was also truth. The United States, already the world's dominant economy, continued to grow. The 1950s were a time of suburban expansion, of interstate highways and shopping malls, of television and consumer abundance. American workers earned wages that allowed them to buy homes, cars, appliances that their parents could only have dreamed of. The American middle class expanded to include a majority of the population. This was the era of American confidence, of belief that economic growth was natural and endless, that each generation would automatically be better off than the last. What made this growth possible? The answers are complex, involving technology and education and social peace. But the Bretton Woods system played a crucial role. The fixed exchange rates provided stability and predictability that facilitated international trade and investment. Companies could plan for the long term, knowing that currencies would remain stable, that the rules would be clear and consistent. Trade grew rapidly as tariffs were reduced through successive rounds of negotiations under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. The dollar's role as a reserve currency was central. Countries needed dollars to pay for imports, to settle international debts, to hold as reserves backing their own currencies. America provided these dollars through its balance of payments deficits, spending more abroad than it earned through exports. American military bases in Europe and Asia spent dollars. American tourists travelled abroad spending dollars. American companies invested overseas, sending dollars. American aid programs continued, though at lower levels than the Marshall Plan, still distributing dollars around the world. This system had an elegant logic. The world needed dollars, and America provided them. As long as the dollar was trusted, as long as it was as good as gold, because it could be converted to gold at $35 per ounce, the system worked beautifully. Countries accumulated dollars and were happy to do so because dollars earned interest and could be easily used for trade. America could run deficits without the painful consequences that would force other countries to adjust, because American deficits were providing what the world needed: liquidity, the oil that kept the machinery of international trade running smoothly. The IMF settled into a comfortable role during this period. It wasn't at the centre of the action. Countries didn't need to borrow from it much because growth was strong and the system was stable. But it provided a forum for discussion, a place where finance ministers and central bankers could meet and coordinate policies. It collected data, published studies, monitored the global economy. It was there if needed, a kind of insurance policy that countries hoped they wouldn't have to use but were glad existed. The World Bank found its new purpose in development lending. With European reconstruction largely complete, the bank turned to Latin America, to Asia, to the newly independent nations of Africa. It funded dams like the Kariba Dam on the Zambezi River, highways in Turkey, irrigation projects in Pakistan. The idea was that infrastructure investment would help poor countries develop, would create the foundation for growth and prosperity. Whether this approach was as successful as hoped is debatable. Development proved far more difficult and complex than building infrastructure. But the bank was active, lending billions, claiming to help the world's poor countries catch up with the rich. The growth of international trade during this period was extraordinary. In 1950, total world exports were about $61 billion. By 1970, they had grown to over $300 billion, a five-fold increase in just 20 years. This wasn't just inflation. Real trade, adjusted for price changes, grew rapidly as countries specialized in what they did best and traded for the rest. German cars and machine tools, Japanese electronics, American aircraft and computers, French wine and fashion. Goods flowed across borders in volumes never before seen. The fixed exchange rates made this trade easier because they eliminated exchange rate risk for most transactions. If you were a German exporter selling to America, you knew what your dollar revenues would be worth in Deutsche Marks because the exchange rate was fixed. You could plan, could price your goods, could make long-term contracts without worrying that currency fluctuations would wipe out your profits. This predictability encouraged the expansion of trade and the lengthening of supply chains. Capital began to move more freely as well, though still under more restrictions than would come later. American companies invested in Europe, building factories, buying existing companies, establishing the European operations that would make them truly multinational corporations. European companies invested in America. The flow of investment helped spread technology, helped build productive capacity where it was most profitable. The Bretton Woods system, with its stable currencies and clear rules, made this investment flow possible and relatively safe. But even in this golden age, even as the system seemed to be working beautifully, there were signs of potential problems. An economist named Robert Triffin, a Belgian who had worked on post-war European reconstruction and monetary policy, identified what came to be called the Triffin dilemma. His analysis, published in 1960, was elegant and troubling. He pointed out that the Bretton Woods system had a fundamental contradiction built into it. The world needed dollars to use as reserves and for international transactions. To supply these dollars, America had to run balance of payments deficits, had to send more dollars out than it took in. But the more dollars that accumulated abroad, the less credible became the American promise to convert dollars to gold at $35 per ounce. Think about the mathematics. America's gold reserves were finite, about $20 billion worth at the official price in 1960. But the amount of dollars held abroad was growing every year as America ran deficits. At some point, there would be more dollars held abroad than America had gold to back them. This created a confidence problem. As long as everyone believed the dollar was as good as gold, it didn't matter that America couldn't actually convert all outstanding dollars to gold. No one would try to convert them all at once. But what if confidence wavered? What if dollar holders started to worry that America's gold reserves were inadequate, that the $35 per ounce price couldn't be maintained? Then they might start converting dollars to gold, and the gold reserves would drain away, and the system would collapse. Triffin saw that the system faced a choice between two bad options. Either America stopped running deficits, which would deprive the world of the dollars it needed and would likely cause a global recession, or America continued running deficits, which would eventually undermine confidence in the dollar and force either a devaluation of the dollar against gold or the abandonment of gold convertibility altogether. There was no way to avoid this dilemma within the structure of the Bretton Woods system. It was inherent, inevitable, just a question of timing. In the early 1960s, this seemed like a theoretical problem, something that might matter in the distant future but wasn't urgent. The system was working so well, growth was so strong, that it was hard to take seriously the idea that something fundamental was wrong. But some people were paying attention, particularly the French. Charles de Gaulle had returned to power in France in 1958. And he had strong views about the international monetary system and America's privileged position within it. De Gaulle and his economic advisor, Jacques Rueff, argued that the dollar's role as reserve currency gave America what they called an quote, _8 America could run deficits indefinitely, because other countries needed to hold dollars as reserves. This meant America could buy up foreign assets, could invest abroad, could fund its military presence around the world, all without having to worry about balance of payments, constraints that would force other countries to adjust. It was unfair. They argued it gave America power that it hadn't earned and shouldn't have. The French began converting some of their dollar reserves into gold, not enough to cause a crisis, but enough to make a point. Between 1965 and 1968, France converted about $1.5 billion into gold, which had to be shipped from Fort Knox to the Banque de France. This was legal, perfectly within the rules of Bretton Woods. But it was provocative. It was a challenge to American dominance, a statement that France would not simply accept a dollar-centered system forever. Other countries watched nervously. They didn't necessarily agree with French grandstanding, but they shared some of the concerns. Britain faced periodic sterling crises as the pound came under speculative pressure. The pound was valued too highly given Britain's economic problems, but the British government was reluctant to devalue because of the loss of prestige and because devaluation would hurt holders of sterling reserves, many of them Commonwealth countries that Britain wanted to maintain good relations with. But maintaining an overvalued pound required running tight economic policies, accepting slower growth and higher unemployment than Britain wanted. Germany faced the opposite problem. The Deutsche Mark was undervalued, which made German exports very competitive, but also imported inflation and created pressure for the mark to appreciate. Germany could have revalued the mark upward, which would have been allowed under IMF rules if there was fundamental disequilibrium. But German exporters liked the competitive exchange rate and lobbied against revaluation. These tensions, Britain's pound too strong, Germany's mark too weak, created imbalances that fixed exchange rates were supposed to prevent. The IMF tried to address the liquidity problem by creating special drawing rights, or SDRs, in 1969. These were a kind of international money created by the IMF and allocated to member countries in proportion to their quotas. Countries could use SDRs to settle debts with each other, could hold them as reserves alongside dollars and gold. The idea was to provide additional liquidity without requiring America to run ever larger deficits. It was called Quote 9 because it was supposed to function like gold, but without the need to dig it out of the ground. SDRs were a clever innovation, very much in the spirit of Keynes's original banker proposal, though much more limited in scope. They provided some additional liquidity, took some pressure off the dollar, showed that the international community could create new mechanisms to adapt the system, but SDRs were too little, too late. They didn't solve the fundamental Triffin dilemma, they just postponed the day of reckoning. Through the 1960s, America's gold reserves slowly drained away. Not dramatically, not in a panic, but steadily. In 1950, America held about $20.6 billion worth of gold. By 1960, it was down to about $17.8 billion. By 1968, it was below $12 billion. Meanwhile, dollars held abroad grew from about $8 billion in 1950 to over $40 billion by 1968. The mathematics was becoming impossible to ignore. Private markets noticed too. In London, there was a private gold market where gold could be bought and sold at market prices, not the official $35 per ounce price. In the early 1960s, when confidence in the dollar was still strong, the market price stayed close to $35. But as doubts grew, private buyers began bidding up the price, seeing gold as a better store of value than dollars. By 1968, the market price had risen above $40 per ounce. The major central banks formed the London Gold Pool, agreeing to sell gold into the market to keep the price at or near $35, defending the official price. But this required using up gold reserves to satisfy private demand, which was exactly what the Triffin dilemma predicted would happen. In March 1968, after a particularly intense period of gold buying, the gold pool collapsed. The central banks announced they would no longer sell gold to private buyers, would only transact among themselves at $35 per ounce. The private market could do whatever it wanted. This was a significant crack in the system. It created a two-tier gold market, an official price for governments, a floating market price for everyone else. It showed that the official $35 price was under severe pressure, that market participants didn't believe it could be maintained, but governments pretended this was a solution rather than a symptom of deeper problems. The Bretton Woods system staggered on, working but under increasing strain. The late 1960s were the high point and the beginning of the end. The system had delivered unprecedented prosperity, had created stability that facilitated the greatest period of economic growth in human history. The 30 glorious years, the economic miracle, the post-war boom, whatever you called it was real, and it was extraordinary. Hundreds of millions of people had seen their lives transformed, had experienced security and opportunity that their grandparents could never have imagined. The Bretton Woods system deserved some credit for this, for providing the framework within which all this growth occurred. But the contradictions were becoming unmanageable. The system required confidence in the dollar, but the accumulation of dollars abroad was undermining that confidence. It required stable exchange rates, but some rates were clearly wrong, and the political will to adjust them was lacking. It required American restraint, but America was fighting an expensive war in Vietnam and expanding social programs at home. The _10_ policies that were creating inflation and deficits. Something would have to give. Let the golden age rest in your mind for a moment. The 1950s and 60s, when it seemed that prosperity and growth were natural, that the problems of the 30s had been solved forever, that the Bretton Woods system had created the foundation for permanent stability. Picture the factories humming, the trade flowing, the currency stable, the workers prospering. It was real. It was remarkable, and it couldn't last. But for a time, for those 30 glorious years, it seemed like humanity had finally figured out how to organise the international economy in a way that worked for everyone. The dream was beautiful, even if it was fragile. Let it settle gently as we prepare to see how the dream began to fracture. The cracks that had appeared in the late 1960s deepened into fissures as the new decade began. The Bretton Woods system, which had seemed so solid during its golden years, was revealing the fundamental contradictions that economists like Robert Triffin had predicted. The mathematics was catching up with the promises, and no amount of goodwill or clever policy could indefinitely postpone the reckoning. America's position was becoming increasingly difficult. The country was fighting a war in Vietnam that was costing billions of dollars every year. President Lyndon Johnson had launched the Great Society, an ambitious set of domestic programs, Medicare, Medicaid, expanded education funding, the war on poverty, that required enormous government spending. Johnson believed America could afford both guns and butter, both war abroad and expanded social programs at home. This was the confident assumption of a rich country that had never really had to choose, that had always been able to do everything it wanted, but guns and butter together created inflation. When government spending exceeds what the economy can produce without pushing up prices, inflation is the result. And inflation in America had consequences that went far beyond American borders because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. When the dollar's purchasing power eroded through inflation, every country holding dollars as reserves saw the value of those reserves decline. It was a quiet form of expropriation, a way of taxing the rest of the world to pay for American policies. The American balance of payments deficit, which had been manageable in earlier years, grew larger and larger. In 1960, the deficit was about $3.8 billion. By 1965, it was over $5 billion. By 1968, it exceeded over $11 billion. These were enormous sums, and they meant that dollars were flowing out of America at an accelerating rate, accumulating in foreign central banks and private hands, piling up as potential claims on American gold reserves. Gold continued to drain from Fort Knox. The total had fallen below $11 billion by 1969, while dollars held abroad exceeded $50 billion. The ratio was becoming absurd. If even a fraction of dollar holders decided to exercise their right to convert dollars to gold at $35 per ounce, America's gold reserves would be exhausted. The system was running on confidence and inertia, on the assumption that no one would actually test whether America could honour its commitments. Charles de Gaulle in France was testing those commitments deliberately. He gave a press conference in February 1965 that was extraordinary in its bluntness. He criticised the dollar's privileged position, argued that the gold exchange standard, the Bretton Woods system, was fundamentally unfair because it allowed America to run unlimited deficits, while other countries had to maintain discipline. He called for a return to a pure gold standard, where all currencies would be backed by gold rather than by dollars that were themselves supposed to be backed by gold. De Gaulle's economic advisor, Jacques Rueff, had been making this argument for years in academic journals and policy papers. Rueff believed that the ability to print reserve currency gave America an unfair advantage, what he called deficits without tears. Other countries had to earn foreign exchange through exports or by attracting investment. America could simply print dollars, and because other countries needed dollars for reserves and for trade, they had to accept them. This allowed America to buy foreign assets, to invest abroad, to maintain military bases around the world, all without the normal constraints that would force adjustments. The French weren't alone in their concerns, though they were most vocal. Other European countries, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, worried about importing American inflation. When dollars flooded into their economies, their central banks had to buy those dollars to maintain fixed exchange rates, which increased their money supply, which created inflation. they were being forced to inflate their own economies to accommodate American policies. This bred resentment, a sense that America was exporting its problems to the rest of the world. Germany faced a particularly difficult situation. The Deutsche Mark was clearly undervalued. German exports were extraordinarily competitive, creating large trade surpluses. Capital was flowing into Germany as investors sought the safety and returns of a strong economy. To maintain the fixed exchange rate, the Bundesbank, Germany's central bank, had to sell marks and buy dollars, which increased the German money supply and created inflation that the stability-conscious Germans found intolerable. The obvious solution was to revalue the mark upward, to change the exchange rate to reflect economic reality. The IMF rules allowed this if there was fundamental disequilibrium, which clearly existed. But revaluation was politically difficult. German exporters, who were thriving under the competitive exchange rate, lobbied fiercely against it. German politicians worried about the impact on employment and growth, and there was a principled argument that if America was creating the problem through excessive deficits and inflation, America should solve it rather than forcing Germany to adjust. This unwillingness to adjust exchange rates was a problem throughout the system. Countries with undervalued currencies didn't want to revalue because it would hurt their exporters and slow their growth. Countries with overvalued currencies didn't want to devalue because it was seen as an admission of failure, a loss of prestige, a signal of economic weakness. So exchange rates remained fixed even when they were clearly wrong, creating growing imbalances and tensions. Britain finally devalued the pound in November 1967, after years of crisis and struggle. The pound was cut from $2.80 to $2.40, a devaluation of about 14%. Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television to assure the British public that this didn't mean, quote, 12 was worth less, which was technically true for domestic prices but which sounded hollow, given that the nation's currency had just been officially declared less valuable than it had been. The devaluation was humiliating for Britain, another reminder of decline, another blow to the prestige of what had been the world's dominant currency. The speculative pressures on currencies grew more intense. Currency traders and large corporations learned to anticipate which currencies were vulnerable, which exchange rates were unsustainable. They would move money out of weak currencies and into strong ones, betting that devaluations or revaluations would eventually occur. These speculative flows made the central bank's job harder, forcing them to use more reserves to defend exchange rates, creating the very crises that speculators were betting on. It became a self-fulfilling dynamic, where the expectation of currency changes made those changes more likely. The French franc came under pressure in May 1968, during the social upheaval of student protests and worker strikes that nearly brought down the government. The franc was clearly overvalued given France's economic problems, and speculators bet heavily on a devaluation. The French government, as a matter of national pride, refused to devalue, instead imposing strict exchange controls and receiving support from other central banks. The franc survived without devaluation, but the episode showed how fragile the system had become, how vulnerable to political events and speculative attacks. Meanwhile, Germany came under intense pressure to revalue the mark upward. In the spring of 1969, speculation that Germany would revalue brought massive capital inflows. The Bundesbank was forced to buy billions of dollars in just a few days, flooding the German economy with marks and threatening to create severe inflation. The German government finally agreed to let the mark float temporarily, which meant suspending the fixed exchange rate and letting the market determine the mark's value. This was technically a violation of Bretton Woods rules, but Germany felt it had no choice. After a few months of floating, Germany established a new, higher fixed rate, a revaluation of about 9%. These currency crises were symptoms of a deeper problem. The Bretton Woods system assumed that exchange rates could remain fixed for long periods, adjusting only when there was clear fundamental disequilibrium. But in a world of large capital flows and different national inflation rates and political constraints on adjustment, maintaining fixed rates was becoming impossible. The rigidity that had provided stability was turning into a straitjacket that forced countries to choose between domestic economic goals and international commitments. America faced this choice most acutely. The Johnson administration had tried to maintain fixed exchange rates while also pursuing expansionary domestic policies and fighting the Vietnam War. The result was inflation, deficits, and gold drain. When Richard Nixon became president in January 1969, he inherited these problems. Nixon was not particularly interested in international monetary policy. Domestic politics and foreign policy toward the Soviet Union and China were his primary concerns. But he couldn't ignore the economic pressures building around the dollar. Nixon's initial approach was to try to tough it out, to maintain the existing system while hoping that growth and some modest policy adjustments would ease the pressures. His Treasury Secretary, David Kennedy, and later John Connally, worked to defend the dollar's gold parity, arguing that devaluation or abandoning gold convertibility would undermine American credibility and damage the international monetary system. But the gold continued to drain away, the deficits continued to grow, and other countries grew increasingly frustrated with American policies. By 1970, the Bretton Woods system was clearly in crisis, though the nature and severity of the crisis was still debated. Some economists argued that the system could be saved through policy coordination if America would control inflation and reduce its deficits, if Germany and Japan would revalue their currencies, if everyone would show more flexibility and cooperation, the system could continue. Others believed the system was fundamentally broken, that the contradictions identified by Triffin were irresolvable, that some dramatic change was inevitable. The academic debates about international monetary reform grew intense and detailed. Dozens of proposals circulated for how to fix or replace the system. Some suggested making SDRs more important, reducing the role of the dollar and gold. Others proposed a return to a true gold standard with much higher gold prices. Still others argued for flexible exchange rates, abandoning the whole idea of fixed rates and letting currencies float based on market forces. These debates filled economic journals and international conferences, but they seemed disconnected from the mounting crisis that was overwhelming policymakers. European countries proposed various reforms to reduce their dependence on the dollar. The idea of European monetary integration began to gain traction. If European countries could coordinate their monetary policies and eventually create a common currency, they could challenge the dollar's dominance and protect themselves from American monetary indiscipline. These ideas would eventually lead to the euro, but in the early 1970s they were still mostly aspirational, still decades away from realization. The Nixon administration watched nervously as America's gold reserves continued to decline. By early 1971, gold reserves had fallen below $10 billion, while dollars held abroad exceeded $50 billion. The mathematics was undeniable. If foreign dollar holders decided to convert even 20% of their holdings to gold, America's entire gold reserve would be gone. The official gold price of $35 per ounce, maintained since 1934, was clearly unsustainable. The private gold market price had risen well above the official price, reaching $43 per ounce by early 1971. This spread between the official and market prices was a signal that informed observers didn't believe the official price could be maintained. Gold was worth more than $35 per ounce in a free market, which meant the dollar was worth less than the official rate claimed. Every day that the official price remained at $35 was another day of pretending that economic reality didn't exist. In the first half of 1971, pressure on the dollar intensified dramatically. In May alone, foreign central banks had to buy over $4 billion to maintain exchange rates, an enormous sum that flooded their economies with unwanted money. Germany and the Netherlands announced they would let their currencies float rather than continue absorbing dollars. The system was breaking down, with countries abandoning fixed rates because maintaining them had become too costly and disruptive. Nixon and his advisers faced a choice. They could continue trying to defend the existing system, which would require severe domestic austerity, raising taxes, cutting spending, accepting recession to reduce inflation and the balance of payments deficit. This was politically unthinkable, especially with an election coming in 1972. Or they could abandon gold convertibility, ending the commitment that had been at the heart of Bretton Woods since its creation. This would be dramatic, would shock the world, would mark the end of an era, but it would free America from the constraints that the gold-dollar link imposed. Through the summer of 1971, the pressure became unbearable. In the first week of August, a congressional subcommittee report suggested that America might have to devalue the dollar or suspend gold convertibility. This created panic. Foreign central banks demanded gold in exchange for their dollars, testing whether America would honour its commitments. Britain alone requested $3 billion in gold conversion. The drain was accelerating, approaching a run on Fort Knox. Nixon knew he had to act. He called his key advisers to Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland, for a secret meeting on August 13th and 14th, 1971. The group included Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and various other officials. They debated through the night what to do about the dollar crisis that had been building for years and was now reaching its climax. The weight of the decision was enormous. They were contemplating ending the monetary system that had governed the world for a quarter century, stepping into unknown territory with consequences no one could fully predict. Let that moment rest in your mind. The summer of 1971. The system crumbling. The gold draining away. The contradictions that had been built into Bretton Woods from the beginning, finally overwhelming the structure that had been created with such hope at a mountain hotel 27 years earlier. The dream of stable currencies and cooperative management was collapsing under the weight of mathematics and national interests. Nixon and his advisers at Camp David, deciding the fate of the international monetary system, preparing to announce a decision that would change the economic order forever. The pressure building, the crisis imminent, the old world about to end. Breathe slowly. Picture those men in August debating through the night, knowing something fundamental was about to change but uncertain what would emerge from the chaos. The decision was made at Camp David on that August weekend in 1971. Nixon would announce that the United States was suspending the convertibility of dollars into gold. The window, as it came to be called, would close. Foreign governments would no longer be able to exchange their dollars for gold at $35 per ounce, or at any price. The commitment that had anchored the Bretton Woods system, the promise that had made the dollar as good as gold, was being abandoned. The decision was fundamentally about preserving American freedom of action. Maintaining gold convertibility meant accepting constraints on American economic policy, meant prioritizing international commitments over domestic needs. Nixon and his advisers, particularly Treasury Secretary John Connally, were unwilling to accept those constraints. Connally famously said that the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem, a blunt statement of American priorities. If other countries didn't like American policies, they could adjust their own currencies. America would do what was best for America. The announcement was scheduled for Sunday evening, August 15th, 1971. Sunday was chosen deliberately because financial markets would be closed, giving policymakers time to prepare before trading resumed on Monday. Nixon would address the American people on television, explaining the decision in terms that emphasized domestic economic benefits rather than international monetary arcana. Most Americans had no idea what gold convertibility meant or why it mattered. They needed to be told this was good for them, good for American jobs and prosperity. The speech was part of a broader package of economic measures. Nixon announced a 90-day wage and price freeze to combat inflation, tax cuts to stimulate growth. and a 10% surcharge on imports to protect American industries, and pressure other countries to revalue their currencies. This combination was meant to address the domestic economic problems that had contributed to the dollar's weakness: inflation, slow growth, rising unemployment. The suspension of gold convertibility was presented as just one element of a comprehensive economic plan. On that Sunday evening, Nixon appeared on television screens across America. He looked calm, confident, presidential. He spoke about the need to protect American workers, to create jobs, to restore prosperity. He announced the wage and price freeze, the tax cuts, the import surcharge, and then, almost casually, he said that he had directed Treasury Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That word was important. It suggested this was a tactical pause, a breathing space, not a permanent abandonment of the system. In reality, the suspension would never be lifted, but temporary sounded less frightening than permanent. The reaction in America was muted. Most people didn't understand the significance of what had just happened. The stock market, when it opened on Monday, actually went up, interpreting the measures as pro-growth and good for American business. The wage and price freeze was controversial, interfering with free markets, some said, but many Americans supported strong action to control inflation. The import surcharge worried some economists who feared retaliation and trade wars, but others saw it as overdue protection for American manufacturers. The international reaction was very different. Finance ministers and central bankers were shocked. Some had expected America might eventually devalue the dollar or suspend gold convertibility, but the abrupt, unilateral nature of the announcement was jarring. There had been no consultation, no warning, no attempt to negotiate a multilateral solution. America had simply decided to change the rules. And everyone else would have to deal with the consequences. The gold window closing meant that the foundation of the Bretton Woods system was gone. If the dollar wasn't convertible to gold, then the fixed exchange rates pegged to the dollar were floating on nothing, just American promises that had proven to be conditional. What did it mean to maintain a fixed rate to the dollar when the dollar's value was no longer anchored to anything real? The certainty and stability that had characterized the system for 2 decades evaporated overnight. Currency markets went into chaos when they opened on Monday. Central banks didn't know what to do. Should they continue buying dollars to maintain exchange rates? But why maintain rates to a dollar that was no longer backed by gold? Should they let their currencies float? Should they stop buying dollars entirely? Each country made its own decisions, creating a patchwork of different policies. Some currencies floated, others maintained managed rates. The system that had been unified and rule-based fragmented into improvisation and uncertainty. The import surcharge was particularly provocative. It was a violation of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which prohibited exactly this kind of unilateral trade barrier. But America was powerful enough to violate the rules and dare others to retaliate. The message was clear. America would protect its interests, and the international institutions and agreements that America had created and championed would not be allowed to constrain American freedom of action. European countries were angry and frightened. They had built their post-war prosperity on stable exchange rates and open trade, on the Bretton Woods system that America was now unilaterally dismantling. They worried about competitive devaluations, about trade barriers, about a return to the economic nationalism of the 1930s. They demanded negotiations, wanted America to work with them to create a new system, rather than simply abandoning the old one without a replacement. Japan was hit particularly hard by the announcement. The yen had been fixed at 360 yen to the dollar since 1949, a rate that had made Japanese exports extraordinarily competitive and had fueled Japan's economic miracle. The Nixon shock, as it came to be called in Japan, forced an eventual revaluation of the yen that Japanese exporters feared would devastate their industries. The abrupt way America had acted, without consulting Japan despite their alliance, created lasting resentment and a determination to never again be so dependent on American economic policy. Negotiations began almost immediately to try to create some new framework, some replacement for the system that had just collapsed. The Group of 10, the major industrial countries, met repeatedly through the fall of 1971, trying to find agreement on new exchange rates and new rules. America wanted other countries to revalue their currencies upward against the dollar, which would effectively devalue the dollar without having to change the official gold price. Other countries wanted America to show more restraint, to control inflation, to participate in a truly multilateral system rather than dominating it. The negotiations were difficult and often bitter. John Connolly, representing America, was aggressive and unapologetic. He made clear that America would not return to gold convertibility, that other countries would have to adjust to American priorities. European finance ministers tried to maintain some semblance of cooperative problem-solving, but American power and American willingness to use that power unilaterally shaped the outcome. The weak might propose, but the strong would dispose. By December 1971, an agreement was reached at a meeting at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. It was called the Smithsonian Agreement, and Nixon hailed it as, quote, 16. This was typical Nixonian hyperbole, and the agreement's significance was actually that it didn't solve anything fundamental. It was a temporary patch, an attempt to restore fixed exchange rates without addressing the underlying problems that had destroyed the Bretton Woods system. Under the Smithsonian Agreement, the dollar was devalued against gold from $35 per ounce to $38 per ounce, about an 8% devaluation. But this was purely symbolic because the gold window remained closed. America wasn't actually selling gold at $38 per ounce or at any price. The official gold price was just a number, disconnected from reality. Other currencies were revalued upward against the dollar by various amounts. The yen went from 360 to the dollar to about 308. The Deutsche Mark was revalued upward by about 14%. The agreement also widened the bands within which currencies could fluctuate. Previously, currencies were supposed to stay within 1% of their official parity. Now they could move 2.25% in either direction, allowing more flexibility. This was an acknowledgement that perfectly fixed rates were no longer sustainable, that some movement was necessary. But it was unclear whether even these wider bands would be enough to accommodate the pressures of different inflation rates and capital flows. The import surcharge was lifted as part of the Smithsonian Agreement, removing the immediate threat of trade wars. But the whole episode had shown how fragile international cooperation was, how quickly it could break down when national interests diverged. The trust that had characterized the Bretton Woods era had been damaged. Countries learned that they couldn't rely on American commitments, that rules could be changed when they became inconvenient for the powerful. The Smithsonian Agreement was supposed to create a new period of stability, but it lasted less than 2 years. The fundamental problems remained unresolved. America continued to run large deficits. Inflation continued to erode the dollar's value. Other countries were still unwilling to let their currencies appreciate as much as market forces suggested they should. Speculation against weak currencies and in favour of strong ones intensified, making central banks' jobs impossible. In February 1973, the dollar came under renewed pressure. The Smithsonian parities were clearly unsustainable. Speculators bet heavily that the dollar would have to be devalued again, or that other currencies would have to be revalued. Foreign central banks were forced to buy enormous quantities of dollars, over $10 billion in just the first few weeks of February, to maintain the fixed rates. The intervention was futile. The amounts were too large, the speculative pressure too intense. On March 1st, 1973, foreign exchange markets in Europe closed, unable to continue operating under the strain. On March 12th, after emergency consultations, the major currencies began to float against the dollar. This was initially presented as temporary, but it would become permanent. The era of fixed exchange rates was over. The Smithsonian Agreement was dead, and with it died the last remnants of the Bretton Woods system. The move to floating exchange rates wasn't planned or desired. It was forced by circumstances, by the impossibility of maintaining fixed rates in a world of mobile capital and divergent national policies. Economists had debated for decades whether fixed or floating rates were better. Now the world was going to find out through experience rather than choice. The major currencies would float, their values determined by supply and demand in foreign exchange markets, rising and falling based on trade flows and capital movements and speculation and central bank intervention and countless other factors. This was frightening for many people. Fixed exchange rates had provided certainty and stability for more than 2 decades. International trade and investment had flourished under that certainty. What would happen when currencies could move 5 or 10 or 20% in a matter of months? Would trade collapse? Would chaos return? Would the 1930s repeat? These fears were real and not entirely irrational. The world was stepping into unknown territory, abandoning a system that had worked, more or less, for a generation. Nixon himself seemed almost indifferent to these developments. He was consumed by the Watergate scandal by this point, fighting for his political survival, distracted from international monetary matters that had never particularly interested him. His Treasury Secretary, George Shultz, who had replaced Connolly, was more of a free market economist, more comfortable with floating rates than Connolly had been. Shultz believed that markets could set exchange rates better than government officials could, that floating rates would actually be more stable and efficient than the rigid fixed rates that had just collapsed. European countries tried to maintain some fixed rates among themselves, creating what they called the snake, a system where European currencies would float jointly against the dollar but maintain fixed rates with each other. This was an early step toward European monetary union, an attempt to create a zone of stability in a world of floating rates. But the snake proved difficult to maintain. Different inflation rates and economic conditions in different European countries created tensions. Britain tried to join and had to leave after just 6 weeks. France left and rejoined multiple times. The snake survived but showed how difficult monetary coordination was even among countries committed to the idea. By mid-1973, the world had a new monetary reality. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold. Exchange rates floated. The IMF's original purpose, managing fixed exchange rates, had become obsolete. The institutions created at Bretton Woods still existed, but they would need to find new roles, new purposes, new ways to be relevant in a system that bore little resemblance to what Keynes and White had designed 3 decades earlier. The Nixon shock, as that August 1971 announcement came to be known, was the end of an era. The Bretton Woods system, which had governed international finance for a quarter century, which had provided the framework for unprecedented global growth and prosperity, was finished. It had died not because of war or depression, but because of its own internal contradictions, because the mathematics of the Triffin dilemma had caught up with the promises, because America was unwilling to subordinate domestic priorities to international commitments. Let that moment settle in your mind. August 15th, 1971, Nixon on television, casually announcing the end of gold convertibility, most Americans not understanding what it meant. The world's financial officials shocked and scrambling to respond. The old order ending not with violence or drama, but with a televised address and bureaucratic negotiations. The certainty of fixed rates giving way to the uncertainty of floating markets. An era closing, quietly but irrevocably. Breathe slowly and picture that transition, that moment when the world's monetary system changed fundamentally, when the architecture built at Bretton Woods was abandoned, the confidence of the golden age giving way to the anxiety of the unknown. Rest with that image as we prepare to explore what came after. What emerged from the collapse of the old system? The world entered uncharted territory in 1973. For the first time since the gold standard's collapse in the 1930s, the major currencies floated freely against each other, their values determined by markets rather than by government decree. No one knew quite what to expect. Would this floating system be stable or chaotic? Would it facilitate trade and growth or hinder them? The theories were untested. The reality would have to be discovered through experience. The first years of floating rates coincided with economic turbulence that made it hard to judge whether the new system was working. In October 1973, just months after the major currencies began floating, war broke out in the Middle East. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The war was brief but intense, and it had consequences far beyond the battlefield. Arab oil-producing countries, angry at Western support for Israel, decided to use oil as a weapon. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, announced an embargo on oil shipments to countries supporting Israel, particularly the United States and the Netherlands. More significantly, OPEC decided to raise oil prices dramatically. In just a few months, the price of oil quadrupled, from about $3 per barrel to over $12. This was an economic earthquake. Oil was the lifeblood of modern industrial economies, essential for transportation, for heating, for manufacturing. When oil prices quadrupled, the costs rippled through every sector of every economy. The oil shock created what economists call stagflation, the combination of stagnant growth and high inflation. Conventional economic theory said this shouldn't happen. Either you had growth with low unemployment and rising prices, or you had recession with high unemployment and falling prices. But in the mid-1970s, countries experienced the worst of both worlds, rising unemployment and rising inflation simultaneously. The old policy tools didn't work. If you stimulated the economy to reduce unemployment, you worsened inflation. If you tightened policy to control inflation, you deepened the recession. Floating exchange rates added another layer of complexity to this economic turmoil. Currency values swung wildly in response to changing oil prices, inflation rates, trade flows, and speculation. The dollar, freed from gold, depreciated against strong currencies like the Deutsche Mark and the Swiss franc, but appreciated against weaker currencies like the British pound and Italian lira. Exchange rate movements of 10 or 15% in a year became common, creating uncertainty for businesses engaged in international trade. Companies that had grown accustomed to the stability of fixed rates now had to manage currency risk. If you were a German company selling to America, you might agree on a price in dollars, but by the time you were paid, the dollar might have fallen against the mark, reducing your actual revenue. Companies began using financial instruments, forward contracts, currency options, to hedge against exchange rate movements. A whole new industry of foreign exchange trading and risk management emerged. The markets adapted, but the adaptation took time and involved costs and complications that hadn't existed under fixed rates. Central banks struggled to figure out their role in a floating rate system. They could intervene in currency markets, buying or selling their own currency to influence its value, but how much should they intervene? If they intervened too much, they were defeating the purpose of floating rates. If they didn't intervene at all, exchange rates might become too volatile, might overshoot reasonable values and create economic disruption. Different countries took different approaches. Some intervened frequently, trying to smooth currency movements. Others intervened rarely, trusting markets to find appropriate values. The Federal Reserve in the United States under Chairman Arthur Burns struggled with the conflicting demands of managing inflation, supporting growth, and maintaining some stability in the dollar's value. Burns tried to do all three and succeeded at none. Inflation remained stubbornly high, over 6% in 1973, over 11% in 1974. Growth slowed, turning negative in 1974 and 1975. Unemployment rose from less than 5% in 1973 to over 9% by 1975. The dollar depreciated against strong currencies, but without bringing the trade balance into equilibrium. Britain faced an even worse crisis. The combination of oil price increases, high inflation, labour unrest. And a weak pound created what some called the worst economic crisis since the war. Inflation reached over 24% in 1975. The pound fell from over $2.40 in 1972 to below $1.60 by 1976. The government imposed wage controls, cut spending, and eventually had to seek help from the International Monetary Fund. The British application to the IMF in 1976 was humiliating. Britain, one of the founders of Bretton Woods, one of the great powers that had designed the international monetary system, was now a supplicant, asking for a loan on conditions set by international bureaucrats. The IMF imposed strict requirements, spending cuts, tax increases, monetary restraint, as conditions for the loan. These were the kinds of policies the IMF typically demanded from developing countries, and having to accept them was a bitter reminder of how far Britain had fallen. The IMF itself was searching for a new role. Its original purpose, managing fixed exchange rates and providing short-term balance of payments financing, was obsolete now that rates floated. But the institution existed, had staff and expertise, and wanted to remain relevant. It began repositioning itself as a crisis lender, providing financing to countries in severe economic difficulty in exchange for policy reforms. This would become the IMF's main function for decades, though it was quite different from what the Bretton Woods architects had envisioned. In 1976, the international community tried to formalize the new monetary arrangements. At a meeting in Jamaica, IMF members agreed to a set of amendments to the IMF's Articles of Agreement. The Jamaica Accords, as they came to be called, officially recognized floating exchange rates as legitimate. Countries could choose to float their currencies or to peg them to another currency or to a basket of currencies. There was no longer one required system. The amendments also officially demonetized gold, declaring that it would no longer be the basis of the international monetary system. The demonetization of gold was symbolic. Gold had been at the heart of monetary systems for centuries, had been what gave money its value and credibility. Now it was being declared just another commodity, valuable for jewellery and industrial uses, but no longer the foundation of monetary order. The official gold price of $42.22 per ounce, it had been raised once more after the Smithsonian Agreement, was abandoned. Central banks could buy and sell gold at market prices if they wanted, but gold would have no official role in the monetary system. In practice, central banks continued to hold gold as part of their reserves. The metal retained value and credibility even without an official monetary role. But the Jamaica Accords mark the formal end of the gold standard in any form, the final severing of the link between money and precious metal that had existed for thousands of years. Money was now pure fiat, backed only by government promises and the productive capacity of economies. This was a radical change, though it happened gradually enough that most people didn't appreciate its significance. The 1970s were difficult years economically. After the first oil shock came a second one in 1979, when revolution in Iran and then war between Iran and Iraq disrupted oil supplies again. Prices spiked from about $13 per barrel to over $35. Another wave of inflation and recession swept the world. Unemployment in America and Europe reached levels not seen since the Depression. Confidence in government's ability to manage economies eroded. The prosperity and growth of the Bretton Woods era seemed like a distant memory. Yet amid all this turbulence, the floating exchange rate system survived. It was messy and volatile, created new risks and uncertainties, but it didn't collapse. International trade continued to grow, though more slowly than in the Golden Age. Companies adapted to currency risk. Financial markets developed new instruments to manage that risk. The worst fears of competitive devaluations, of trade wars, of a return to the chaos of the 1930s didn't materialize. One reason the system survived was that America, despite abandoning gold convertibility, maintained the dollar's role as the primary reserve currency. Countries continued to hold dollars as reserves, to invoice trade in dollars, to use dollars for international transactions. The dollar's dominance actually increased in some ways after Bretton Woods ended. Without the constraint of gold convertibility, the Federal Reserve could supply as many dollars as the world wanted, and the world still wanted dollars because America remained the largest economy, because dollar-denominated assets offered good returns, because there was no alternative currency that combined size, liquidity, and relative stability. Europe made tentative moves toward creating an alternative. The European monetary system, established in 1979, was an attempt to create a zone of currency stability in Europe, a step toward eventual monetary union. But this was still decades away from the euro, still a modest regional arrangement that didn't challenge dollar dominance globally. Japan's yen became more important as Japan's economy grew, but it remained primarily a regional currency. No currency could match the dollar's global reach and acceptance. The World Bank continued its work during this period, largely unaffected by the collapse of Bretton Woods. Its mission had always been development rather than monetary management, and that mission continued. It lent billions for projects in developing countries, with mixed results. Some projects succeeded, building infrastructure and supporting growth. Others failed, creating debt burdens without corresponding development benefits. The bank faced growing criticism from both left and right. From the left for supporting authoritarian governments and damaging environmental policies, from the right for inefficiency and for subsidizing policies that free markets should handle. The development agenda itself was changing. In the 1950s and 60s, the focus had been on large infrastructure projects, on the idea that building dams and roads and power plants would create the foundation for growth. By the 1970s, it was clear that infrastructure alone wasn't sufficient. Countries needed effective institutions, rule of law, educated populations, policies that encouraged entrepreneurship and investment. The World Bank slowly adapted to this more complex understanding of development, but the adaptation was gradual and often contentious. Meanwhile, private international finance was growing rapidly. In the 1950s and 60s, most international lending had been either government to government or through institutions like the World Bank. But in the 1970s, private banks discovered they could make enormous profits by lending to developing countries. Oil exporting countries had vast revenues from the high oil prices and deposited much of that money in Western banks. The banks needed to lend those deposits out to earn returns, and they found willing borrowers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. This petrodollar recycling, as it was called, seemed to work for everyone. Oil exporters earned interest on their deposits. Banks earned fees and interest on loans. Developing countries got capital to invest in development. But the system was building toward crisis. Many of the loans were made at variable interest rates, meaning the interest payments would rise if market rates rose, and many countries borrowed far more than they could reasonably repay, lured by easy credit and optimistic assumptions about future growth and commodity prices. By the late 1970s, a new figure had emerged at the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker became chairman in August 1979, appointed by President Jimmy Carter to fight inflation that had spiraled out of control. Volcker was a towering figure, physically imposing at 6 feet 7 inches, and he had the courage and determination to do what was necessary to break inflation even if it meant severe short-term pain. He announced that the Fed would focus on controlling the growth of the money supply, would let interest rates rise to whatever level was needed to squeeze inflation out of the economy. Interest rates soared to unprecedented levels. The prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, reached over 20% in 1980, and again in 1981. Mortgage rates exceeded 18%. These extraordinarily high rates strangled economic activity. The American economy fell into severe recession in 1981 and 1982. Unemployment reached nearly 11%, the highest since the Depression. Businesses failed. Farms were foreclosed. The pain was real and widespread. But Volcker didn't flinch. He maintained tight monetary policy despite intense political pressure to ease. President Reagan, who had taken office in January 1981, supported Volcker despite the political cost of high unemployment, and the policy worked. Inflation, which had been over 13% in 1980, fell to less than 4% by 1983. The credibility of the Federal Reserve, which had been severely damaged by the inflation of the 70s, was restored. People began to believe again that the Fed could and would maintain price stability. The high American interest rates had global consequences. They attracted capital from around the world as investors sought the high returns available on dollar-denominated assets. This drove up the value of the dollar dramatically. Between 1980 and 1985, the dollar appreciated by over 50% against other major currencies. This made American exports expensive and imports cheap, creating large trade deficits. But it also demonstrated the dollar's continued dominance. When America tightened monetary policy, the whole world felt the effects. For developing countries that had borrowed heavily in the 1970s, the Volcker shock was catastrophic. Their loans were denominated in dollars, and many had variable interest rates. When American interest rates rose, their debt service costs soared. At the same time, the strong dollar made their exports less competitive, and commodity prices fell as global recession reduced demand. They faced a perfect storm of rising debt costs, falling export revenues, and evaporating access to new credit. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could no longer make payments on its foreign debt. This triggered what became known as the Third World Debt Crisis, or the Latin American Debt Crisis. Other countries quickly followed Mexico's example. Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, the Philippines, country after country, announced they couldn't pay. The total debt involved was hundreds of billions of dollars. American and European banks that had lent this money faced the possibility of massive losses, potentially threatening the stability of the global financial system. The crisis required years to resolve, involving complex negotiations between debtor countries, creditor banks, the IMF, and Western governments. The IMF took the lead, providing emergency financing to countries in exchange for strict austerity programs and economic reforms. These programs were controversial and painful. They required cutting government spending, raising taxes, devaluing currencies, opening economies to foreign competition. The social costs were enormous: rising unemployment, falling living standards, political instability. The 1980s in Latin America came to be known as the lost decade. Economies stagnated or contracted. Per capita incomes fell. Poverty increased. The optimism of the 1970s, when easy credit had funded ambitious development plans, gave way to the harsh reality of debt overhang and adjustment. The crisis showed the risks of floating exchange rates and unrestricted capital flows, the way that financial integration could transmit shocks globally, the power of American monetary policy to shape economic conditions worldwide. By the mid-1980s, a new international monetary reality had taken shape. It was very different from Bretton Woods, more market-driven, more volatile, less managed. Exchange rates floated, sometimes wildly. Capital moved across borders in enormous volumes, seeking returns and fleeing risks. The IMF had become primarily a crisis manager, imposing austerity in exchange for emergency loans. The dollar remained dominant despite, or perhaps because of, the end of gold convertibility. And the world had learned that floating rates and financial integration could create instability and crisis, as well as flexibility and efficiency. The Bretton Woods era was definitively over, not just formally but psychologically. The assumptions that had guided policy for decades, that fixed rates were essential, that capital flow should be controlled, that international cooperation could manage the monetary system, had given way to a new set of ideas emphasizing markets, flexibility, and national autonomy. Whether this new system was better or worse than Bretton Woods was debated endlessly by economists and policymakers. But one thing was clear. There was no going back. The world had moved on. Let the turbulence of those years settle in your mind for a moment. The oil shocks and stagflation, the floating currencies and financial crises, the high interest rates and debt disasters, the world searching for a new equilibrium after the old certainties collapsed, Volcker's determination to break inflation regardless of cost, developing countries crushed by debt they couldn't repay. The system adapting, surviving, but very different from what had existed before. The elegance of Bretton Woods replaced by the messy reality of markets and crises. Breathe slowly and picture the transition, the old order gone and the new one still taking shape. The confidence of the golden age replaced by the uncertainty of a more chaotic world. Rest with that transformation as we move toward understanding what emerged from all this upheaval. The turbulence of the 1970s and early 80s eventually gave way to a kind of equilibrium. Not the stable, managed system of Bretton Woods, but a different kind of order based on floating rates and market forces and the continuing dominance of the dollar. By the late 1980s, this new system had proven it could function, could facilitate trade and growth, could survive crises without collapsing into the chaos that so many had feared. The question was no longer whether the post-Bretton Woods system could work, but whether it worked well, whether it served the world's needs, what its strengths and weaknesses were. The legacy of Bretton Woods is complex and multifaceted, visible in institutions that still exist, in lessons that were learned and sometimes forgotten, in ongoing debates about how to organize international finance. Let's explore what endured, what changed, and what the Bretton Woods era teaches us about cooperation and power, about markets and management, about the possibilities and limits of international economic order. The most obvious legacy is institutional. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, created at Bretton Woods, still exist more than 80 years after that July conference in New Hampshire. They have evolved enormously, have taken on roles quite different from what their founders envisioned, but they endure as permanent features of the international landscape. This in itself is remarkable. International institutions are fragile things, easily abandoned when they become inconvenient. That the IMF and World Bank survived the collapse of the system they were designed to manage suggests they filled real needs, provided real value. The IMF transformed from an institution managing fixed exchange rates to one managing financial crises. Its main function became providing emergency loans to countries facing balance of payments, crises, foreign exchange shortages, debt problems. These loans came with conditions, policy reforms that the IMF believed were necessary to restore stability and growth. The conditions were often controversial, seen by critics as imposing a one-size-fits-all neoliberal model that prioritized creditor interests over the welfare of people in crisis countries. The IMF's role in the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 1998 illustrates both its importance and its limitations. When Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea and other Asian countries faced sudden capital flight and currency collapses, the IMF provided tens of billions in emergency loans. But the conditions attached to those loans, high interest rates, fiscal austerity, closure of weak banks, were blamed for deepening the crises and causing unnecessary suffering. The debate over whether the IMF helped or hurt continues to this day. The IMF also became a forum for international monetary cooperation, a place where finance ministers and central bankers met to discuss global economic issues. The annual meetings brought together policymakers from around the world, creating opportunities for coordination and dialogue. During the global financial crisis of 2008, the IMF played a crucial role in coordinating responses, in providing emergency lending, in helping prevent the crisis from becoming another Great Depression. The 2008 crisis in many ways validated the lessons of Bretton Woods. when the American housing bubble collapsed and financial panic spread globally. Governments responded with massive intervention. Central banks flooded the system with liquidity. Governments bailed out failing banks and implemented large stimulus programs. The IMF provided over $250 billion in emergency loans. This aggressive response, coordinated internationally to some degree, prevented the crisis from spiraling into depression. The lesson of the 1930s, that financial crises require strong government action and international cooperation, had been learned. The World Bank's evolution took it far from its original reconstruction mission. By the late 20th century, it had become primarily a development institution, lending to poor countries for projects meant to reduce poverty and promote growth. Its effectiveness was debated. Some argued the bank had helped lift millions out of poverty through infrastructure investment, health programs, education initiatives. Others claimed it had wasted billions on poorly designed projects, had supported corrupt governments, had imposed Western models of development that didn't fit local conditions. The bank's lending shifted over time in response to changing ideas about development. In the 1980s and 90s, structural adjustment loans became common. Lending tied to broad economic reforms like privatization, deregulation, trade liberalization. These were controversial, seen by critics as forcing developing countries to adopt neoliberal policies that benefited foreign investors while hurting local populations. The bank later shifted toward poverty reduction more explicitly, toward greater attention to social impact and local participation. By the early 21st century, the bank faced questions about its relevance. China had become a major lender to developing countries, offering infrastructure financing without the governance conditions the World Bank imposed. Regional development banks in Asia, Latin America and Africa provided alternatives. Private capital flows dwarfed official lending. The World Bank still mattered, but its role was less central than in earlier decades. The dollar's enduring dominance is perhaps the most significant legacy of Bretton Woods. Even after gold convertibility ended, even as exchange rates floated, the dollar remained the world's primary reserve currency. Countries held dollars as reserves, invoiced trade in dollars, borrowed and lent in dollars. When crises hit, demand for dollars increased as investors fled to safety. The dollar's role, if anything, strengthened after Bretton Woods ended. This dominance has given America what de Gaulle called exorbitant privilege. America can borrow in its own currency at low interest rates. It can run persistent trade deficits without facing the constraints that would force other countries to adjust. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions affect the entire world. When the Fed raises rates, capital flows toward America and away from other countries, particularly developing ones. When the Fed cuts rates, capital floods out, sometimes creating bubbles in emerging markets. The privilege comes with responsibilities and burdens, though these are often overlooked. America must provide dollars to the world, must maintain deep and liquid financial markets, must accept trade deficits as the counterpart to capital inflows. The need to maintain dollar confidence can constrain American policy in subtle ways, and there are political costs. America's current account deficits, the flip side of its role as reserve currency provider, have contributed to deindustrialization in parts of the country, feeding political tensions and resentment. Challenges to dollar dominance have emerged but haven't succeeded. The euro, introduced in 1999, was seen by some as a potential rival to the dollar. The Eurozone was economically comparable to America in size. If European countries could maintain a stable common currency, perhaps it would gradually displace the dollar in international use. But the euro's problems, the sovereign debt crisis, the structural flaws in Eurozone design, the political divisions among member countries limited its appeal. It became the second most important reserve currency, but never seriously challenged the dollar's primacy. China's rise as an economic power has raised questions about whether the renminbi might eventually challenge the dollar. China has taken steps to internationalize its currency, encouraging its use in trade settlement, establishing currency swap lines with other central banks, creating alternative financial infrastructure. But the renminbi faces obstacles. China maintains capital controls that limit convertibility. Chinese financial markets lack the depth and openness of American markets. Political concerns about Chinese government control and lack of rule of law make many investors wary. The debate about reforming the international monetary system has continued since Bretton Woods collapsed. Economists and policymakers have proposed numerous alternatives, a new Bretton Woods Conference to create updated rules, expanded use of SDRs to reduce dollar dependence, regional monetary arrangements, even global currencies backed by commodities or algorithms. None of these proposals has gained enough political support to be implemented. The existing system, for all its flaws, has proven remarkably sticky. Part of the reason is that dollar dominance benefits not just America, but also other countries that have adapted to the system. Exporters in Germany and China benefit from being able to price goods in a stable, widely accepted currency. Developing countries can borrow in dollars at lower rates than in their own currencies. Central banks can hold reserves in deep, liquid dollar markets. The costs of transition to some alternative system seem higher than the costs of continuing with the dollar-centered system. The lessons of Bretton Woods about international cooperation are mixed. On one hand, the Bretton Woods Conference showed that countries could come together, could subordinate immediate self-interest to create institutions and rules for mutual benefit. The system that emerged facilitated the greatest period of economic growth in human history, helped rebuild war-devastated Europe and Japan, supported the expansion of trade and prosperity. This suggests cooperation is possible and valuable. On the other hand, the system ultimately failed because countries wouldn't accept the constraints it imposed. America abandoned gold convertibility when maintaining it became inconvenient. Other countries wouldn't adjust exchange rates when economic logic demanded it. National interest trumped international commitments when the two conflicted. This suggests the limits of cooperation, the fragility of international institutions when they constrain powerful nations. The tension between national autonomy and international cooperation remains unresolved. Countries want the benefits of international economic integration, trade, investment, growth, but they also want freedom to pursue domestic objectives without international constraints. Floating exchange rates and mobile capital create both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Countries can pursue independent monetary policies, but face constraints from capital flows and market reactions. The policy trilemma: you can have at most two of fixed exchange rates, free capital flows. An independent monetary policy means every country must make difficult choices. The role of economic ideas in shaping policy is another lesson from Bretton Woods. Keynes's ideas about government intervention and demand management influenced the design of the system and policies for decades afterward. The neoliberal reaction against Keynesian ideas in the 1970s and 80s shaped the evolution toward more market-oriented policies and floating rates. The swing back toward Keynesian ideas during and after the 2008 crisis shows how intellectual fashions influence policy. Economic ideas matter, but they're also influenced by power and interests, by what benefits whom. The question of whether fixed or floating exchange rates are better remains debated. Fixed rates provide stability and discipline but require giving up monetary policy autonomy, and can lead to crises when rates are clearly wrong but politically difficult to adjust. Floating rates provide flexibility and autonomy, but create uncertainty, and can lead to large, destabilizing swings. Most economists today favor flexible rates for large economies, but recognize that smaller economies might benefit from pegging to a stable currency or basket. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. The sustainability of large imbalances is another ongoing question raised by the Bretton Woods experience. Can countries run persistent large deficits or surpluses indefinitely, Or do imbalances eventually force adjustment through crisis? The answer seems to be that it depends on how imbalances are financed, on whether they reflect underlying economic fundamentals or policy distortions, on how much trust creditors have in debtors. America has run trade deficits for decades without crisis, but other countries facing similar deficits have experienced painful adjustments. The difference lies partly in America's unique position as reserve currency issuer. The debate about globalization and its discontents connects to Bretton Woods legacies. The system facilitated international trade and investment, helping integrate the world economy in unprecedented ways. This integration has lifted billions out of poverty, particularly in Asia, has created prosperity and opportunities. But it has also created losers, workers in industries displaced by trade, communities devastated by factory closures, growing inequality within countries even as inequality between countries has narrowed. The political backlash against globalization reflects real grievances about how integration's benefits and costs are distributed. Looking forward, the international monetary system faces new challenges. Climate change requires enormous investments in green infrastructure and energy transition, raising questions about how to finance this globally. Digital currencies, whether private cryptocurrencies or central bank digital currencies, could reshape payments and monetary systems in ways we're only beginning to understand. The rise of China and other emerging economies is slowly shifting global economic power, though the institutional architecture still reflects the power distribution of 1944. Some have called for a new Bretton Woods conference to address these challenges, to create updated institutions and rules for a changed world. But the conditions that made Bretton Woods possible, the shared experience of the war, the recognition that the old system had catastrophically failed, the dominance of a few countries willing to lead, don't exist today. The world is more multipolar, interests are more diverse, the status quo has powerful defenders. Incremental evolution seems more likely than revolutionary redesign. The Bretton Woods legacy is ultimately about the possibility and difficulty of international cooperation. It shows that countries can create institutions and rules that transcend narrow self-interest, that these institutions can deliver real benefits, that cooperation is possible even among rivals. But it also shows that cooperation has limits, that power matters, that institutions must evolve or become irrelevant, that national interests eventually constrain international commitments. The system created at Bretton Woods was imperfect, ultimately unsustainable, yet remarkably successful for a quarter century. Its institutions adapted and survived. Its lessons remain relevant. We remember Bretton Woods not just for what it achieved, but for what it attempted. The ambition of trying to build a cooperative international order, the faith that human intelligence and goodwill could design systems to prevent the catastrophes of the past. That ambition and faith, tested and sometimes broken but never entirely lost, remain essential as we face new challenges requiring international cooperation. The spirit of Bretton Woods, if not its specific arrangements, endures as a reminder that we can do better than chaos, that design and cooperation can create order, that institutions can serve human welfare if we have the wisdom and will to build and maintain them. Let these reflections rest gently in your mind. The legacy of a mountain hotel conference, the institutions that outlasted their original purpose, the lessons learned and sometimes forgotten, the tension between national sovereignty and international cooperation, between markets and management, between power and principle. The dollar's dominance, the IMF's evolution, the World Bank's struggles, the ongoing debates about reform, the question of whether we can cooperate to solve global problems or whether narrow interest will always prevail, the memory of Keynes and White, of their competing visions and their shared hope that something better was possible. All of it connected, all of it still relevant. All of it part of the ongoing story of how we organise our economic lives together across borders and differences. Breathe slowly and let it settle. And so we've travelled together through the story of Bretton Woods, from a world broken by depression and war to a mountain hotel where representatives of 44 nations gathered to build something better. We've watched the system rise and flourish, providing the framework for unprecedented prosperity, then slowly crack under its own contradictions, finally giving way to something messier but enduring. The institutions remain, the dollar endures, the questions continue. What does this teach us as you lie here in the quiet as the day fades and sleep approaches? Perhaps it's simply this, that human beings, for all our conflicts and competing interests, can sometimes cooperate to create order from chaos. That the institutions we build are imperfect, shaped by power and circumstance, yet they can serve real needs and deliver real benefits. That nothing lasts forever, that even the most carefully designed systems must eventually adapt or fade, but that the effort to build something better is always worthwhile. The men who gathered at Bretton Woods are gone now. Keynes and White, brilliant and flawed, their debates settled by time and history. The delegates who signed the agreements, who returned to their countries carrying hope for a more stable world. The policymakers who managed the system through its golden age and its decline. All of them part of the past, their work done, their lives complete. But what they attempted endures in memory and in the institutions that adapted to survive. The faith that cooperation is possible, that intelligence and goodwill can shape a better world, that we are not helpless before economic forces but can design systems to serve human needs, this faith remains available to us. We inherit both their achievements and their unfinished work, the problems they solved and the ones they left for future generations. As you drift now towards sleep, let go of the details, the dates and numbers and technical complexities. Keep only the essence, that a gathering at a hotel in the mountains tried to build a better world and succeeded for a time, that institutions can endure and evolve, that cooperation is difficult but possible, that the story continues with each generation adding its chapter. You are part of that story, connected to everyone who has ever tried to make the world work a little better, to create order and fairness and opportunity. Let it all drift away now. The gold and the dollars, the fixed rates and the floating ones, the crises and the conferences, let it fade like a dream half remembered. The mountains of New Hampshire stand still under the same stars that shone on that July conference 80 years ago. The world turns, currencies rise and fall, people cooperate and compete, and you in this moment need only rest. Sleep well. Let the story settle gently into memory. The Bretton Woods Agreement, how America became the world's banker, how nations tried to build cooperation from conflict, it all dissolves now into the quiet of night. Breathe slowly. Release everything. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just this moment, this peace, this gentle drift towards sleep. Rest now. Let go. Good night.